The floor is yours, Sabina.
Thank you so much, Glenda. It's really wonderful for me to be here as the, one of the advisors for the Global Deal. We have a long-standing history, but also to have the opportunity to bring my colleagues from the JustJobs Network, as well as our research consortium from all over the world, top-notch researchers that work on these issues, to be here with you today. So first, of course, I want to thank your team and the OECD for hosting all of us and having this conversation. I think it's in the spirit of exchange between the global North and the global South. We now live in a very interconnected world. What happens in one part of the world has ripple effects in other parts of the world. So I think it's important for us to have more of these exchanges. And so we appreciate this opportunity. I'd like to also thank the International Development Research Center of Canada that has funded all of this for us. So it's important to acknowledge their support and their support over the last several years in also the production of many of the research studies that have fed into this volume. And finally, I'd like to thank all of the consortium members here that have come from, Thailand and Argentina and Sri Lanka and South Africa and from all over the world to have this conversation. For those of our colleagues that may not know the JustJobs Network, we are a research organization that focuses really on one of the most important issues of our time, which is how do we create more and better employment and workforce development in this era of change. I think, when we look at these topics, often there's a tendency to look at them in very siloed ways. We look at the impact of technology on labor markets, or we look at the impact of climate change on labor markets. But on the labor market side of it, what's happening in terms of a surplus of labor in some sectors, a shortage in others, or demographics of aging, or a youth bulge, all of these impacts on the labor market don't work in the same kinds of silos when we look at these transitions. And so a lot of our work at the JustJobs Network looks at how these different forces, technology, climate change, energy transition, urbanization, restructuring of trade, how these different forces affect labor markets and what needs to happen in terms of governance, regulation, company policies to help workers adjust and to create a more fair and inclusive world of work. Just a quick word about this roadshow as well. This roadshow is, we really wanted to do something a little bit different rather than, there's a consortium of researchers from around the world that have been looking at these topics from different angles over the last several years. And as a culmination of some of these research studies, we thought rather than having one big conference in Thailand or India, that we would actually bring a subset of researchers to different institutions to have a variety of different conversations from different perspectives on this very important issue of the platformization of economies, and particularly the impact on work and the place of social dialogue in that context. This was also it enabled us to have a larger footprint in some sense, because we've engaged with the European Commission now, the ILO, we're here at the OECD. Our next stop will be in Washington, DC with the Department of Labor and US Department of State and USAID there. So we have a wide footprint for the findings of our research, but also allows us to reduce our carbon footprint. So we're not bringing 60 people to India, but 10 or 12 people here. So with that, thank you again for having us. We really look forward to an open exchange. To myself and my colleagues will present the context and some of the findings of our research. More details can also be found in this volume, but also extensive studies that are both on the JustJobs Network website. We also have another site called Connected to Work, which is a repository of research on technology and work. And so with that, I think we can go to the next round. Once we present our research, we're really interested in hearing from all of our OECD colleagues in terms of both in terms of your research and your reactions to some of the findings. Perhaps the only last thing I'll say is, you know, through our conversations that we've had so far, one of the things that we've really recognized is there's a lot of similarities in platform work and what services they offer, and how these consumers demand these services and take up these services across the globe. That's uniform. That's something my colleague Huitam has talked a lot about. But of course, how they manifest is determined by a number of regulatory factors, governance factors, demographic factors. And so that's perhaps where I think there's more need for exchange of information on. The platforms are the same, and the services they deliver are perhaps the same, and the demand is the same, but how they play out in terms of labor markets and workers, that is a function of a lot of other factors that need to be understood, and they play out differently in the global north and the global south. So with that, I will perhaps turn to my colleague Prerna, who will take us through some of the context for our work, and then I will say a few words about the social dialogue aspect. We've divided this session into 3 parts, and from our side, each of us, we have 2 people for each session that will present the research and then discuss this from your side.
Sorry to interrupt, but I just wanted to mention that we will be taking some pictures and videos. So if there's anyone who has any objection to that, please let us know, and we won't shoot any footage from your end.
Is it on? It's on. Now it's on. Sorry, for inviting us here. I'm going to start off by presenting an overview of our research and the work that the consortium has done, and then I'll hand it over to Sabina to go a little deeper into the social dialogue aspect of platform work. I can't see. I'm just going to use that. Okay. So, Sabina has already given us an introduction to JJN, so I won't spend too much time on this, but like she said, we're a global research organization and our work focuses on, how to build a better and more inclusive world of work, given all the transformations that are taking place with respect to technology, climate change, trade, migration, etc. And with respect to this particular project, we're looking at various technological transformations that are taking place in the world of work through the platformization of work. And, again, Glenda has already talked about our signature volume, which is right here. We've just released this. We're very excited about it. This has a series of essays by various members of the consortium. A lot of the authors are also here around this table on the growth of the platform economy from a gendered lens. So trying to understand what are the challenges that women face with respect to accessing platform work, and what are the sort of regulations and institutional structures required to enable them to be able to leverage these opportunities better. And this has been edited by my colleagues Sabina and Kaushiki. And our very exciting roadshow that we've been on for the past 1 week. So we're doing 5 events across 4 countries in 10 days to present our findings from this work that we have been undertaking on women's participation in the platform economy for the past 3 years. Okay. So, as technology is transforming work, as a result of cloud computing or AI. Labor markets are changing, and a lot of these changes are being brought about by digital platforms and the growth of the platform economy. So we wanted to look at how do we enable workers to shift between jobs and sectors and tasks to be able to leverage these changes and utilize these changes to access more and better job opportunities. And what are the regulations, what are the institutional structures that are actually required to be able to enable workers to do this better? So how essentially can we leverage the technical transformations in the world of work to create better and more accessible jobs? When we started off this work, we needed to understand the background. And we started off by developing a typology of platform work, Yes. By developing a typology of platform work to understand what are the different type of platforms that are there, the different types of labor platforms that are there that allow people to access economic opportunities. And we divided platforms into two categories that capitalize on the labor value of work versus platforms that capitalize on an asset. So for example, we've got marketplaces, services, as well as other platforms. And in a lot of marketplaces, you have platforms that are the main economic value is being extracted from an asset that is owned by somebody rather than the labor that is being provided by the worker on, say, a location-based platform like an Uber or an online freelancing platform. So we specifically for this research have focused our work on looking at platforms that focus on or that extract economic value from the labor value of the worker. So that would specifically be location-based platforms and web-based platforms. Location-based platforms would be platforms that offer transport services, logistical services, and personal and household services. And web-based platforms would be platforms that offer freelancing or micro work opportunities, as well as platforms that offer work opportunities in the education technology space. We've seen a big growth of that, at least in India in the last few years. And there's more on this typology in the signature volume as well, which we shared earlier. So in the last decade, there has been a 5x increase in digital labor platforms globally. What does this mean in terms of who has access to these jobs? Where are these platforms based? Are they actually creating more and better jobs for workers? Is something that we look at. And what we've seen is, especially in the global South, there is this narrative that platform work is going to provide access to a larger number of jobs to the population, where you have a large and growing youth population. The rate of growth of jobs is lagging behind. So the platform economy is seen as an opportunity for more and more young people to access jobs because of various reasons. There are low barriers to entry. There's more flexibility available to workers in terms of deciding when they want to work, how they want to work, how much they want to work. There's more autonomy. And at the same time, it is believed that it gives workers the flexibility to have multiple sources of income. But what we have seen in our research is also that digital labor platforms, especially the platforms that we've looked at, location-based and web-based platforms, do increase the precarity of work because one of the things that they're doing is they're breaking up tasks into smaller bits and distributing it amongst a pool of workers. And these are tasks that otherwise, or jobs otherwise that would have been concentrated, within one particular line of work or within, with one particular worker. So as you're breaking those jobs up and distributing them amongst a geographically dispersed workforce, you are increasing precarity for these workers. And then the other thing we've seen, and I'm guessing my colleague Aditi will also speak about this more, is the demographics and the impact that that has on workers in the platform economy, especially in sectors where there is a large oversupply of workers. So when we are saying there's a low barrier to entry and the platform economy is providing a lot of job opportunities to people, a lot of these platforms or a lot of these sectors are sectors where there is a large oversupply of labor. And that has a negative impact on workers because it pushes wages down, it leads to deterioration in working conditions and less incentives from the platform's part to ensure that workers have fair working conditions. And in terms of specific challenges that women face with respect to their participation in the gig and platform economy, I think one of the biggest things that is especially relevant for the Global South is the digital divide. According to GSMA's report last year, women are 18% less likely to own a smartphone in the Global South. And mobile phones, smartphones are the primary way through which workers access the internet and access job opportunities prevented by the platform economy. So this digital divide in itself is, creates a difference and a significant challenge for women with respect to being able to access gig and platform work. This combined with the fact that in a lot of countries, the social norms that govern women's ability to work, their mobility, also presents a significant challenge for women. And the last thing that I would like to say is also from what we've seen over the last 3 years, we find that instead of breaking gender norms in work, we find that the platform economy is to a large extent perpetuating gendered forms of work. So we find women engaging in similar gendered roles and types of work that they would have been engaged in offline. So it's not necessarily equalizing or presenting equal opportunities to men and women. And now over to Sabina.
Great. Thanks so much, Prerna. So as Prerna mentioned that, okay, there we go. As Prerna mentioned, we have the platform economy is a new phenomenon that's increasingly becoming the architecture for global transactions in many different spheres. There's also this shift to where it's not just limited to sort of location-based or the conventional location-based or online-based platforms anymore. Increasingly, more and more sectors that sort of had this traditional forms of employment and concentrated jobs are starting to engage more and more gig workers, right? So while gig work is still a relatively small phenomenon in most countries right now, it's growing. And what we're also seeing is sectors that otherwise had traditional jobs are now breaking it up and relying more and more on these sort of self-employed contractors or gig work. The other aspect with respect to women is also the sort of reliance increasingly. So globally, there's been a decline in female labor force participation. And one of the things that a lot of policymakers are looking at is, will these online-based opportunities facilitated through the platform economy enable more women to leverage entrepreneurship and work from home and leverage more home-based opportunities. And so this aspect of digital entrepreneurship is also something to look at with respect to, the fact that in many countries in the Global South, gender norms still keep women at home rather than, enable them and encourage them to go out and claim public spaces. So So many of these things are double-edged swords in some ways. As Prerna mentioned, when you have economies with large and growing youth populations, and at the same time, the inability of labor markets to create enough jobs at the pace and the scale required. And we can take India alone, over 360 million young people between the ages of 15 to 29. That segment alone is higher than the entire population of the United States and certainly every other individual industrialized country. So providing jobs for this large and growing youth population is a big challenge. And what the gig economy and digital entrepreneurship do is provide income generation opportunities, if not jobs. But what is happening at the policy and governance level is that we're increasingly looking at the gig economy and digital entrepreneurship as the solution to job creation, rather than thinking, you know, more seriously about what needs to happen in terms of whether it's sort of what sectors promote growth, you know, looking specifically at different kinds of investments in sectors that are more labor intensive and having more national kind of employment based strategies. Increasingly, there's a focus on, okay, well, gig work is evolving and this kind of platforms are evolving and digital entrepreneurship will kind of fill that gap. And that's deeply problematic when given the backdrop of the inability of institutions to keep up with the pace and scale of this change. We don't yet have proper definitions, particularly in law or legal precedent for how we treat whether we treat these gig workers as workers and extend existing labor laws to them, or we treat them as self-employed and then, you know, and then come up with new instruments of extending Social Security. So this is the backdrop against which we now have a very important dimension, which is the social dialogue dimension, which is traditionally based on, which is traditionally based on a employer-employee kind of labor market relationship. So you have a bipartite relationship between the employer and the employee, or you could have one where the government is involved and you have an employer and employee. But what the platform economy does is now introduce a new intermediary, which is the platform, and creating a very different form of employment relationship, where many of the things that Prerna was talking about, the flexibility, the autonomy, you know, to what extent are these really available to the worker? And certainly social dialogue and collective bargaining and freedom of association are all it becomes challenging to consider how these rights and entitlements are to be considered in this new milieu. So one of the things that I think is really important to point out, that social dialogue is contingent on an economy and a society that already has a more equitable distribution of power in some ways, right? Even if we look at in a number of global South countries where collective bargaining is used and where social dialogue is the most effective, it's often in the formal sector. You don't see it as much in the informal sector. And so if by virtue of introducing now this platformization of work, you are essentially expanding informality, at least definitionally, in terms of the workers that are in informal employment that don't have access to labor protections or social protections, then it has even bigger implications for social dialogue, right? The process of social dialogue, from information exchange to consultation, negotiation, joint decision making, right? These are all contingent on a certain even distribution of power where workers have a strong voice. And this has traditionally been weaker in even segments of the informal segments of economies. And now we're exacerbating that. Oh gosh, how do I go back?
The bottom one.
The bottom one? Oh, okay.
I can do that as well.
Okay, just one slide back, please. Thank you. sorry, one more, I think. No, one forward. Yeah, thank you. So as we've said, you know, particularly in societies that are more fragmented in terms of divisions, not just on the basis of the dual economy, but also on the basis of caste, race, gender, or ethnicity, which tends to be more pronounced in the global South, socioeconomic diversity that manifests in differences in education, skills acquisition, labor market access, and then occupational diversity, which, you know, we have now with the platform economy. If we just look at the fact that, you know, in several of the global South countries, platform economy workers are deemed to be self-employed, but even within that category, there's tremendous heterogeneity, from high-skilled graphic designers to, you know, your street vendors and then your gig workers in between. So to design access to collective bargaining, freedom of association, and then therefore also engage in effective social dialogue with someone on the other end, which we don't know if we can hold platforms or not. Now there's emerging, as Glenda also mentioned, there's emerging examples and models of platforms being held to these obligations, but it's still very difficult when we look at it in an overall very heterogeneous labor market context of the global South. So, as I've already mentioned, when it comes to the world of platforms, there's this kind of definitional ambiguity. And, you know, does the law recognize freedom of association and collective bargaining and the right to strike? And this is fundamental to social dialogue because it is ultimately about a balance of power across the different stakeholders in order to be able to have an effective dialogue. And these rights are some of what underpin the power of workers to actually be able to engage in effective dialogue. Of course, when it comes to the platform economy, workers are harder to mobilize because they're geographically dispersed. And we've already talked about the fact that platforms are not deemed to be employers. And in general, there's an absence of redressal mechanisms and channels for engagement. Now, as we will hear, there are examples of some platforms that are starting to, if not encourage, accommodate these kinds of rights for workers and to have redressal mechanism measures. And so we also need to look at what those models are and how they can be facilitated. And then, as we said, examples of regulation. So moving forward, you know, we need to extend the right to freedom of association and collective bargaining to workers in non-standard forms of work in international and national standards and regulations. And I think this is the very basis for an effective social dialogue. As we've already were mentioning this morning, there's a conversation that's starting at the International Labor Organization to kind of try to come up with these standards. There's, of course, the European directive. And so it's worth kind of looking at what is happening both in these two forums, but also we heard from in our previous event, we heard from the Norwegian mission to the EU about different models that Norway is adopting, where they have actually facilitated collective bargaining agreements in the context of platforms. We also need to look at which platform models and incentives are more conducive to enabling better working conditions and redressal mechanisms and worker organization, and of course, social dialogue. And recognizing different worker arrangements that enable workers to collectivize, right? So traditional unions that were a strong force for factory workers may not be the same exact solution that we can deploy now, given the fact that we have such a geographically dispersed workforce and growing number of self-employed workers. So we'll stop there and go on, I think, to the reactions from our colleagues.
Yeah, absolutely. So now we have Maria Aleksinska, who is a development economist at the OECD Development Center. So over to you, Maria.
You have a presentation.
Yes, indeed. Thank you very much. And Sabine, if you could kindly pass me the.
Yes, of course.
Thank you. Yes, thank you very much to everyone. Good morning to all the participants, the organizers, and our guests. It's really a pleasure to be here. And first of all, let me start by congratulating the team on preparing and producing this study, which I very much enjoyed reading. And second of all, for organizing this road trip, which I find a very innovative way of doing things. So congratulations, and hope that it all goes well for you. Let me start by saying that one of the things that I take out from reading this report, and well, kind of which confirms what I a little bit knew before, but it really exposes it very well, is that when we speak about the platform economy in the global south, it's actually something quite different from the platform economy in the global north, right? So the OECD has been pioneering the research and advancing of the policy agenda on regulation of platform work. But of course, most of the examples and the ideas concern the global north. Even if in the global south we can be inspired by these ideas, indeed it's very important to understand the contexts, where we come from, why this work is done, by whom, for which reasons, and how it compares to other alternatives, right? Because if in the global north, the alternatives is often the traditional wage employment, and this is where we platform workers are coming from, it is not necessarily the same in the global south. So the initial path and the alternative is very different, and hence the implications are very different. So I guess that's one of the things that we really have to keep in mind, perhaps even throughout this whole discussion today. Now, this being said, I found indeed the research findings that you have here very rich. And so when thinking about how to build my intervention, I thought that I would focus perhaps on two aspects that are closest to my own work that I've done before the OECD, but also most recently at the OECD. And this concerns the two issues. First, the flexibility of women work, and second, the issue of informality and how that articulates with digital platforms. So the question of flexibility, that's the question that you are raising in your study, whether digital labor platforms are a solution to the work-life balance puzzle, especially for women. And I find this question fascinating, and what I'd like to have as a sort of a reaction and to complement a little bit your findings with the findings that we have also from elsewhere. So the first one is actually the fact that what we need to understand is that when we say flexibility, we need to be very clear and very mindful of the fact that flexibility determines the types of tasks that people will be doing, men or women, right? But it happens that it's mainly women, right? Because when we say that women need to combine this type of work with family responsibilities, looking after children, elderly, sometimes disabled relatives, homework, home tasks, etc., and they need flexibility for work, we have to realize that what we mean is that this flexibility means that they have to look for tasks that are very easy to execute, right? The shortest and the easiest, so that they indeed can juggle many responsibilities. What this means is that if you come to a platform with the view of grabbing the fastest task, the easiest to execute, it's obvious that this task will require very low level of skill, that this task will not let you develop new skills, and this task will be lowest paid, right? Which means that it will confine the workers, whoever they are, men or women, into the lowest paid, low prospect types of work. right? And so what happens is that actually, because it's mainly women who are doing these tasks, we indeed see this segregation in the types of tasks and hence of the occupations in the labor markets between men and women that are the reason that are caused by this flexibility, right? And not only we see the segregation which mimics the segregation on the offline labor markets, right? Women do like the easiest tasks, but I would say that in some contexts it even enroots it even further. And this also relates to the fact that men have more time, more possibility, more luxury to look for longer tasks in which they develop their skills, in which they also establish longer term relationships with their clients and reputation, which is key for the platforms. Also, if we speak about the platforms that allow you to have access to internationally available jobs, these are again will be mainly men who will have the possibility to access those types of tasks and hence have a higher pay. So again, we're really enrooting this segregation by income and the tasks. The second thing about the flexibility is what I actually find it a little bit funny is that when we speak about flexibility, flexibility argument mainly concerns women. When we ask men why they do platform work, they'll tell you, well, because we want autonomy. We don't want to have a boss. We want to have more earnings, right? Flexibility is great for women. They're so happy to combine this with other tasks. And so in some sense, what platforms create is this kind of promise on the level of a society that because flexibility is possible, women should be continuing doing all the other tasks that they're doing, and men don't have even to bother about this, right? Because now there is this option. So, and hence again, for me, this is some sort of a false promise of women empowerment and of gender progress in certain sense. Now, let's leave this one and let's move to another one, to the other argument of the informality. So indeed, at the OECD Development Center, where I work, we released just 1 month ago a report on informality and globalization in search of a new social contract, where we have a full chapter dedicated to the question of whether digital platforms help solving the informality problem. And so we indeed also ask the question whether digital platforms create formal employment. Well, to answer this, and that again resonates a lot with the work that you have done. So to answer this question, basically, what we argue is that first you need to ask the question whether digital platforms create any employment to start with. And only once we know whether they create any employment, we can say, do they create formal or informal employment, right? And so here you can like look a little bit like, it can work a little bit as an algorithm, right? So yes, no, the nodes, right? So we have seen that, well, in some sectors and occupations, the answer would be yes. So this concerns some of the tasks that were not previously monetized and the platforms allow to monetize. We would say a neutral effect for some other tasks. For example, these are traditional services that always existed in labor markets and were always performed by self-employed, such as taxi drivers. So the platforms simply mediate this work and allow to channel it and connect clients easily. And then you would have other sectors where what platforms have done is that actually they destroyed the traditional wage employment and replaced it by self-employment that is now mediated and channeled through the tasks. So the answer is very ambiguous, that there is a genuine employment creation. The truth is that we do not have exact data for this. For this, we would have to have labor force surveys with dedicated questions to this. This we don't have. But what is important is also then to say, for each of these nodes, so is there formal or informal employment, creation or destruction, right? And what we do know is that all of these processes result in the fact that, in fact, all of this work now is performed by self-employed in the majority of cases, 99% of the cases, right? So if you're self-employed, I mean, in some sense, there is no reason why you should be informal, right? You can be formal, right? But here we're back to the question of the contexts. So in the developing countries, the contexts are such that, first of all, most of the self-employed are actually not registered, so they remain informal. The second thing is that for the small majority of those who are registering and becoming formal, there is still the risk of actually becoming finding oneself in a disguised employment relationship. And this is because of the way the platforms operate. You can become dependent either on a platform or on one of the clients that constantly supplies you work through the platforms. So then there is this risk of, you are formally formal, but de facto you are actually, you should have been protected by the labor rights, but you are not. And so basically what we find is that genuine, independent, formal self-employment concerns only a very, very small portion of people. And again, our take is that perhaps even the majority, well, the problem will be even more serious for women if we want to look at those issues. So finally, to wrap up on this is that what is interesting is that platforms, the way that they build their discourse is that actually they say that they carry a formalization potential, right? Because they say, well, to register on the platform, you have to supply your ID, bank details, on the transactions are recorded. So in some sense, there is a potential for formalization. It can be actually a formidable tool for formalization. But for this potential, what we see is currently not realized. For this, we would need to have the cooperation from the platforms. They have to be interested in doing this. We have to have a coordination between governmental agencies because basically it's a matter of ministries of finance, of economy, of labor to coordinate and see how this can be effectuated. We have to maybe perhaps even think of adapting certain laws, such as data protection laws, so that this information about the transactions can be shared with tax and social security authorities. And even if we do all of this, there are, as your report shows, that there are still risks of switching yet to other channels of work, such as through social media. So once you have your clients, you still can do your work through Facebook, through Messenger, through WhatsApp. So which means that we really have to, think one step before the platforms because they go very fast. And the question is, how do we indeed adapt our rules in the society so that we don't have to run as a police after each new type of work, but that all types of work that exist can allow workers to still be protected. And those are, of course, very, very big questions. Well, thank you very much. And I look forward to the rest of the discussion.
Thank you so much, Maria. That was
Hello, thanks for inviting me. It's been really interesting reading the report. So congratulations on that. I particularly like the focus on gender. We haven't worked on these issues since 2019, but sadly there still remain whatever we did back then still remains very relevant today, and that's sad because we've been hammering on about these issues for a while. And while there's some change, there's still a lot to be done. And we saw that during the COVID crisis, how many platform workers suffered because they didn't have the right protections. So in 2019, we wrote an employment outlook dedicated to the future of work. And one of the main conclusions that came out of that was that we weren't so worried about a jobless future. What the main risk we saw was one of inequality, growing inequalities. And I think these new forms of work can contribute to these growing inequalities. And the other thing that we noticed is that none of that was inevitable. A lot of that boiled down to policy choices. We see more growth in these forms of work in some countries than in others, and that often reflects policy choices. So again, it's sad that we're still in this situation in many countries and there's still so much work to be done, despite the fact that we've talked about this for so long. And despite the fact that we've seen what happened recently during the COVID crisis. Now, one thing that we did is, so we looked at the platform economy and we saw that many workers were vulnerable. Not all, it's a very heterogeneous kind of economy or sub part of the labor market, but many workers within that, within the platform economy are very vulnerable. And so we tried to figure out what the sources of vulnerability were, because that would help us enable that would help us think about what the solutions were. And essentially we came up with, I think, what is quite a useful framework to think about these issues. Of course, this applies, it was developed for the global north, but I think it applies to the global south as well. So what are the sources of vulnerability that we identified? The first one is misclassification, the classification of workers, wrongly classifying them as self-employed workers, whereas when you look at the reality of their working situation, they should be employees. The second one is what we call workers in the gray zone, and workers who are difficult to classify. But then the third source of vulnerability has nothing to do with classification. And I think you referred to this during the presentation. It's the issue of monopsony, of imbalance in bargaining power between workers and employers or clients. And I'll talk about each one of these in a little bit more detail to explain what I mean. So misclassification is probably the easiest one to understand. I think we all know most countries have criteria for classifying workers, and yet we know that many platforms do misclassify workers for obvious reasons, because it becomes a lot cheaper to hire workers that way. Sometimes workers like it as well in some cases, because they also pay lower taxes, and so they somehow are short-sighted and select into these forms of work, not thinking about what might happen in case they have an accident, or not thinking about what might happen when they retire. So it's sometimes short-sightedness on the workers themselves as well, although sometimes they don't have a choice, and I'll come back to that issue later on. And so there's a whole lot of things that you can do to tackle misclassification. You can make the rules clearer, because sometimes employers just don't know the rules. Let's give them the benefit of the doubt. Sometimes that is the case. Sometimes it's just very costly for workers to challenge their status. As an individual, challenging your status against the employer, the risks are high for you, but also it often costs much in terms of court fees, or bring all the proofs to demonstrate that you should be an employee. So making that easier for workers is something else that you can do. Unions can play a really important role here, and allowing unions, for example, to take cases to court is really important. And then, of course, there's other things that we can do in terms of strengthening labor inspectors, which are often very weak in many countries, are not prepared for these new forms of work. Strengthening the penalties for employers. I mean, sometimes what happens is that one worker might challenge a situation, they then become reclassified as employee, but it's just them. It's not all the workers who are in the same situation. And then there's all these incentives, as I mentioned, or referred to earlier, around taxation. Often these new forms of work are taxed less. Self-employed workers are taxed less than employees. And so you have these incentives built into the system for workers to be misclassified as self-employed workers. So that's the issue of misclassification. I think there's a lot you can do here to address, to give workers the rights and the benefits they're entitled to by addressing this issue. I personally still think that even when you do that, there will always be workers that are difficult to classify. Now, I'm going to grossly simplify things here, but if you think about a lot of the ride sharing, yes, they have characteristics of employees, but they can also choose when they work and whether they work. Okay. Heavy caveats here, but I'm simplifying things. So it is difficult to decide whether or not they are employees or not. And this has been reflected in court decisions, which have been mixed across many countries. The problem with many of these workers is that often they are still left as self-employed. And that means they have no rights and benefits, or very few. And yet they have vulnerabilities which employees would be protected for. So in those cases, what we have urged countries to do is to think of ways to extend rights and protections to these workers. Some rights and protections are easier to extend to these workers than others. But even things like minimum wages in New York City, for example, have been extended to platform workers. So we can think creatively about this. The way to do this, I think, is first of all, you need to think about what are the groups of vulnerable workers that are, or the groups in the gray zone. And I think there's a number of ways you can think about it. Some countries have thought about specific occupations. Some countries have thought about the kind of financially dependent self-employed. So there's different ways of identifying workers in the gray zone. And then you need to decide, what rights and protections can you extend to these workers? And one thing that I think is crucial for these workers in the gray zone is collective bargaining rights. that I think a lot of the rights or a lot of the working conditions could be improved for these workers by extending collective bargaining rights. Because I think there's so much, taking an occupational or even a sectoral approach to these things is a much more flexible approach to finding, so first of all, understanding what the specific challenges are in that sector and occupation, and then finding solutions. It might be much more, I think it's much more promising than regulation at a national level, which would affect different groups of workers, which is much more complicated. So this is workers in the gray zone. And many countries have, in fact, extended collective bargaining rights to workers in the gray zone, however they define these workers. But the third point I want to make is that it's not just an issue of classification. Sometimes, of course, these things can happen simultaneously, but there's often an issue of labor market monopsony. Many of these workers do not have outside options. We see this in Europe, for example. Many of the workers who work for platforms are recent immigrants who find it very difficult to work to find jobs. And so they have very little bargaining power because they cannot say, if I don't have these working conditions, I'm going to go somewhere else. They are stuck in these jobs, and platforms know this, and platforms exploit this. So in those cases, it's not an issue of just worker classification. It's an issue of enhancing bargaining power. And that can be, again, by extending collective bargaining rights to these workers. It can also be through labor market regulation. One of the negative effects of monopsony power is lower wages than would be efficient in an efficient markets. And so minimum wages actually are one way of counteracting this imbalance in bargaining power. But then, of course, you can also tackle the kind of monopsony power directly in terms of there's informational asymmetries, but you can also train workers, given more opportunities to find jobs elsewhere. So there are various things that you can do to kind of redress this imbalance in bargaining power. So I think this framework is useful to think about what the challenges are for some of these workers. And I think it's important to think about what the underlying vulnerabilities are, because you cannot, if you misdiagnose the vulnerabilities, you might not be finding the right solution. So that's what we've been arguing for a while. And in fact, some of the things that we saw recently emerge in Europe are very promising. I think they follow, whether or not that was intentional or not, but they follow this kind of thinking. And I think that's very promising. And I hope that will be replicated in more countries than just in the European ones. So that's it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Do you want to react? I have a few questions as questions from the audience, but if you want to say something in reaction, go ahead.
Just a couple of three very quick points. I think first, with respect to Maria's discussion about flexibility, I think one of the things that's really worth noting is, as you pointed out, research shows that the way that women engage with tasks on platforms is less intense than men do. And because of the nature of their domestic responsibilities, it really constrains the kinds of activities they can do. But what we're also finding from our field research is often this leads to a kind of de-skilling, right? So you have women that have PhDs or have very high levels of education that are doing the quick kind of tasks. And also that with this kind of work, there's no mobility, right? You're in this task and you're doing it repetitively and you're doing it indefinitely. So a lot of the workers that are doing this kind of work are thinking about it very much as being temporary, although it's not clear what and how they will ever have the opportunity to branch outside of it. That's one point. The second is, Maria, you also mentioned that, this kind of data that platforms are collecting could be a formidable tool for formalization in some ways. And I think one of the things that it always makes me think of is, well, how do we define informality? Because we can make all of these workers visible, but unless we actually are able to also provide them with labor protections as well as social security, which is how we define informality, then making them visible will not be far enough. So, you know, this is a big thing in India, and there's now the Indian government is thinking about coming up with these welfare boards and to extend Social Security benefits. But it's, you know, and this actually brings me to my third point, which is picking up on what Steen was saying, that a lot of these workers are in the gray zone. And so even when you're trying to make them visible, if you get this data from platforms, you need to still be able to connect them with Social Security, and then what kind of benefits can you afford and who should get what, right? So my last point, Steen, is really to you with respect to workers in the gray zone. I find it really hard to think through employer-based models of entitlement provision now, because the very employer, you know, considering the fact that more and more workers in labor markets, in majority in many countries, are actually self-employed, and within that category there's such enormous heterogeneity, the idea that an employer, that employer-employee relationship is no longer there. It's in different forms. It's in, when we have some platforms that don't enable the kind of autonomy and flexibility and have more control. But I think that given the fact that these non-standard forms of work are emerging, and there's greater and greater heterogeneity in labor markets now, thinking and having a very fragmented approach to the provision of entitlements won't, in my view, won't work. And I think it's inevitable that we need to really think through public sector provision financed through private taxation and other contributions. So those were my 3 points.
Thanks a lot. So there is a question. I'll start from the first question from the audience, and then I have some myself. So from the International Labour Organization has opened a debate on the possibility of setting a normative instrument on decent work in a platform economy. And what's your opinion on the possibility of adopting such an instrument with the aim of ensuring a minimum floor of labor rights on a global scale for platform workers?
What's my opinion?
Challenging.
Yeah, well, what's my opinion? I think it's about time. I think it's great. I think it's going to be very, very difficult to work out all of the details in all the issues we were just talking about, right? The heterogeneity and the right to freedom of association, collective bargaining. We've seen debates in the ILO in the past on the right to strike. I think all of these issues are very, very difficult issues, but that's what we have the ILO for, and that's what we need the ILO for. And so I think that it's great, and I think it will take a few years before we have this kind of normative mechanism, but it's fantastic that the debates are starting finally.
And then I have a question myself on the first of a few questions I have. So the first ones, we haven't talked about, you know, to what extent the platform economy can be an opportunity of, we said it's an opportunity to enter the labor market, but how about skills development? How about training? And I've been around long enough that we were having these discussions about fixed term work many years ago now. And the idea there, I mean, the question that everybody was asking, are they dead ends or stepping stones? So I think it's pretty much the same questions we can ask about the platform economy, especially if we think of young people, potentially women entering the labor market through the platform economy, migrants, for example, who may not have all the papers and all the qualifications needed to access work in other sectors. So, I mean, do we have any data? Do you have any thoughts about how far the platform economy are stepping stones, and so these workers then move on to better jobs, and whether that is related to any skills development or training they are getting, which I suppose is actually quite limited in many cases.
I guess I would step out for a second. Ramiro, you can also feel free to come in, and Aditi also on this question. But my own sense from the workers that we have spoken to, and some of our partners, the studies that they've done in different countries, is that the platform economy, you might get some basic skills training, but it's not with an eye to any kind of mobility. So you might have a static skill that allows you to provide a service through the platform, but it's not with an eye to constantly reskilling and upgrading in a way that will lead to any kind of significant economic mobility. Certainly for women, in all the ways that we've already talked about, given that their engagement is so constrained by other factors, then if you add the skills training to it, even with basic skills training, which they don't, the platforms rarely provide, they just provide basic training initially. But Aditi can talk more about the different platform models and the kinds of skills training they provide. I think I think that's one of the dangers, is that we're again seeing a very replication of offline biases played out online in terms of keeping a group of people in very stagnant roles and occupations and positions without enabling economic mobility of any kind. And then we're adding even more precarity because we're taking jobs and breaking them up into tasks. And so you don't even have the kind of income security, even if you were to have minimum wage legislation that was applied. So I realize that the platform economy is now a genie that's out of the bottle and there's no putting it back in. But I think these are really tough questions in terms of the kind of world that we're looking at, also in terms of actually improving development and providing opportunities for upgrading of skills and so on. More what we're going to see is a bifurcation between high skilled and low skilled in occupations based on several factors. But maybe you guys want to add something.
Yes, just to add that. No, it is that maybe, I mean, what we don't have is a long-term prospect for anything. You know, in the past, you used to have the big firm, and there you can learn by doing, you know, by interacting with others. So in a way, I think that we don't have that, and we will not have that. So maybe the platform is a way to try to find innovative ways to deal with that. But what I see is like more fragmentation and in a way, we are still trying to think about solutions, but I think that we are far away from that.
Linda, you would be able to speak to this question. So we'd be interested in your views.
I think it's the same view you just expressed, right? There's very limited opportunities for, I suppose, for mobility within the platform, and also to use that as a stepping stone. But I guess for young people accessing the labor market, it might be something. I mean, you often hear, but this is anecdotal evidence, right? People doing that while they're studying. And so that's a first access to the labor market. How far employers value that experience, I'm not sure. So that's the question. The fundamental question. I had another question actually about a point that Prerna made. So you were saying that in the end, the platform economy perpetuates gender stereotyping. And so the first question is whether that applies to gender only, or it also applies to, you know, other socioeconomic groups. And in a way, I mean, I'm not surprised, but at the same time, you could imagine that because this is platform work, and it's maybe not also front facing in many cases, that stereotyping that's coming from the demand side, where, you know, you always want the male mechanic and the female nurse and midwife, doesn't apply so much, because this is work where, as I said, sometimes in many cases is not front facing. So is this stereotyping coming from the supply or the demand? I don't know if you have an answer, but it could also, again, be coming from the fact that even through the platform economy, we're not doing enough to push women to professions that are generally male dominated, and vice versa.
Right. I think you're definitely right about the fact that through the platform economy, we are not doing enough to break those gender stereotypes. But so your first question in terms of, is it only gender or is it socioeconomic classes and other differences as well? I think from our research, we found it's other differences as well, because you're starting at an unequal base. So what you find is a lot of the higher skilled jobs that are, from in say web-based work or freelance work are more accessible to people who start off with better education levels, better access to technology, more skills. Whereas a lot of the location-based work, which is, less cognitive skills focused, more manual labor focused, is you find people from lower socioeconomic classes restricted to that. So we're not breaking those societal barriers through platform work for sure. And in terms of, is it coming from the demand side or supply side? I don't know. I mean, I find that a little hard to answer. I feel like, again, this is anecdotal, right? For a lot of us, if we had the option of, say, having a female mechanic or a female cleaner come to do deep cleaning in our house with machines, I think we would be open to it. I think platforms have tried, again, Aditi can probably add to this, have tried to bring in women into more roles that are seen as more male dominated, be that driving or plumbing or carpentry, but to what extent they've succeeded is a real question, and how much they've actually put into getting women into those roles is also a bit of a question mark.
It's interesting because we could have thought that in fact now in the skills area we talk a lot about skills first now, which means basically that the employer is not looking at qualifications or experience, but is looking at the skills. And again, you would have thought that in the platform economy that would have been ideal because there is fewer constraints, because as a user you don't necessarily are exposed to the qualifications or the experience of the person, but it does seem like in the end it kind of replicates the stereotypes of the non-platform economy, but at the same time creating the same challenges basically. So and Aditi, did you want to?
Yeah, I think in kind of coming back to what Sabina said earlier, in sectors where there's a labor oversupply, we find platform companies not having to do a lot of work on any part with the worker, right? Whether it be wages, insurances, anything. But in sectors where there is a limited labor supply and the qualifications and skills really matter, we see employers doing far more to think about what they can do to retain those workers, even if those are contractual workers. In that sense, in the kind of platform companies that we've been looking at over the last 3 years with Sabina, it's been quite nice to see the number and the spectrum of trainings and upskilling programs that some platforms do have. A lot of it has to do with making people more market facing, the soft skills around professionalization, which are definitely useful and necessary. Again, the question kind of comes up around the workforce will constantly need lifelong learning to kind of stay abreast of all the changes that technology will bring. We're studying these at the moment for a very short period of time. But there is more scope of interaction in platforms that do want to retain their workers, right? They take a lot more effort to know who their workers are. They're constantly in communication with them. And if there are more touch points, there's a more potential for some of these things to be included.
Big point. Now, just I think in all of these conversations, one of the things that's also happening is just a shifting of the risk to the worker, right? So whether it's the burden of constantly upskilling or reskilling or economic volatility, there's no longer a shared burden. It's shifting to the worker. And that becomes particularly critical as we look at artificial intelligence that's completely going to upend and is already upending everything. That we're at the same time that we're creating and introducing tremendous volatility, we're also entirely shifting the burden onto workers by themselves. In the absence of social dialogue, that becomes even more scary.
Thank you very much. I think we can move to the next sessions. So in the next session, we're focusing a bit more on social dialogue. And so we'll have Aditi Suri, who has already spoken. So, and Ramiro Albrio, who's a senior economist at Red Sur. So the floor is yours. I don't know who of the two is starting.
Yes. No, maybe you can give the clicker. Thank you. So it'll be both Ramiro and I speaking collectively today as we think about the role of social dialogue in the platform economy in the Global South. And I have to say, it's been a really lovely morning. It's been really lovely hearing all of you. Thank you for sharing your work with us also. I think the level of nuance in this collective group is really high. So thank you for bringing all of your collective work to help support even what we're going to say now. I think some of the major challenges or the context that I wanted to begin this discussion with have been laid out really nicely. So thank you, Maria, for taking us there, and also Sabina's presentation. But I think the idea of social dialogue and how it can be useful for workers in this new age really has to be underscored by the characteristics right, that we see in the Global South, which is, of course, the informal economy and the fact that many people already bear their own risk as they work and earn, right, in our cities and in our countries. And that is seen as a kind of a trend that has carried on. I think there have been decades of work to try and shift informality for many countries in the Global South, and I'm speaking particularly of India. And we have seen it as something that continues to stay, right? So in that sense, I think it's very useful to think about what are the pathways, given these characteristics, that we can move towards stronger social dialogue. And in the future, where we see platforms are not helping engender that relationship. And the other kind of characteristic is that there is an increasing casualization of formal jobs, right? Of the jobs that are in the formal sector, whether those be in government services or in different parts of industry, there is a move towards casualization and gigification, which is a very terrible word, but I think it's a useful metaphor to kind of to think through how even people with employment with the standard employment relationship are finding more and more job opportunities that do not have that. So in this sense, this is a concern for the most vulnerable in our economies who have been over the generations in the informal economy and maybe have not been able to accumulate wealth and skills and mobility, but equally for those who have the qualifications and skills in education who are also now facing similar kinds of precarity. And I think that's a really nice moment of conjuncture that we can think about between the global North and South, that we are facing similar kind of trends in our economies. And so in that sense, I think this is a great moment to think about what are the alternative pathways? How do we get at the tripartite relationship, or how do we think about building the bipartite relationship outside this thing called the standard employment relationship?
Yeah, so I will repeat your thanks to everyone. I think that we are also here to learn, so it's good to hear you. So I think that the timing for thinking about social dialogue now is perfect, because in a way we are seeing this trend that is emerging, you know? So we have time. I think that this idea of learn first and apply later, I mean, it's important for thinking about the platform economy. I mean, going to regulation, I think that's a little tricky, and I'm not sure about thinking about global standards for that. For many reasons. One is, I mean, one regarding standards is that maybe we need to wait for new developments to come in in the platform economy, in artificial intelligence, and so on. Maybe it's too early to think about regulations now. I mean, that's my view. But second, that we need to acknowledge the diversity of the different segments of the labor market. You know, of course, I mean, I believe that for high-skilled jobs in the gig economy that are competing with formal jobs, maybe we can think of something, but it's not the same with, you know, gig work, low-skilled workers that are coming from informality. So, you know, there are totally different segments of the labor market, and we need to take that into account when we think about regulations. And also, we need to think about these structural differences between the North and the South. You know, in a way, you suffer the, you know, the bomol cause disease. You know, that it means that you can pay higher wages and better working conditions for low-skilled workers. That's meant to be a high-income country. The differences are mainly in this, in that with higher average productivity, you can pay better conditions for low skill. But maybe in our countries, we cannot afford that, you know, because in a way, I mean, this high skill, low skill, and also formal, informal is an equilibrium. It's an outcome of our economic structure. It's not the decision of some firm or some entity. So I think that we need to think about global standards. We need to think that maybe in the global South, it is not possible to come up with, you know, meet the conditions of, you know, labor conditions of France for the gig workers, low-skilled gig workers in Togo. Maybe, you know, I mean, that's because the economy is not producing enough goods. It's not, I mean, it has, the productivity is lower than what we need to provide these wages and working conditions for workers. So we need to take that into account. So maybe thinking about the more flexible approach, such as dialogues, maybe that's better than going into discussing specific regulations. I mean, I think that with the dialogues, we can learn over time, we can get data. We didn't say that here, but we don't have any regular or public data on a regular basis about this topic. So we are just having some surveys, some pilot experiences in some countries. That's all we have. So I think that there we need to do better. And finally, I want to say just, you know, we continue talking about formality, formal employment, informal employment. I think that we need to move to a different classification. For example, in Latin America, but it's the same in Asia, informality can be low skill, but also can be high skill workers selling, you know, digital services to Europe. So they decide to be informal. So it's not that we need to help them to, no, we need them to pay taxes. That's a totally different thing. But so what I'm saying is that, you know, when we think about formality, informality, maybe we need to see that. And also that in many of Latin American countries, we have like a working poor in the formal sector. So in a way, you say that you have a contract, everything, but then in real terms, you see that this is poor people that belongs to, I know, the clothes sector, other services. So I think that formality, informality for us, we need to recast maybe or reframe the debate.
Right. And so really picking up from kind of recasting the debate and how do you think about in the future and current kind of environment for workers, what can we do to really move towards a stronger social dialogue? And I've presented three kind of ways that this can happen, and it does happen. And I'm speaking a little bit more about the Indian context, that of course we strengthen the existing collective bargaining institutions in formal employment and make sure that regulation and legislation is really keeping up to date with that and not weakening it in any form. The other is to encourage responsible business, which is a conversation that we can now have at this juncture in the platform economy. We're not sitting in 2015 where Uber is really starting to spread around the world. We're sitting in 2023 where we now know what 10 years of an Uber experience gives us to the world. And there's so many other companies that have come up in the platform economy that can kind of maybe be tamed, maybe be encouraged to be more responsible and better, and to see the different ways in which that can happen. And then, of course, the third example, which Sabina kind of mentioned earlier, is the alternative ways to create the tripartite relationship where it doesn't exist in a formal written contract, right? And in India, we have a few decades of history of creating something called a worker welfare board, which is a state-initiated board which brings together employers, workers' associations, and representatives from the state and central governments to have a lot of the conversations around wages and changes in business. And they also are responsible for the delivery of social protection very often. And so I won't touch on the first and third in this presentation now, but focus right now on what we can do to encourage responsible business, right? And I think the reason I have kind of looked at that is for many years, looked at what Uber and other kinds of food delivery and taxi delivery companies have done to working conditions, which is something all of us across this table know well. It is the kind of big example that we take when we think about what platform work is and what the future of work will be. And with this deep interest in worker well-being, it's been good to think that as the platform economy has evolved, there are many different kinds of business models that use the platform or the multi-sided marketplace model that do not resemble Uber, right? So there's something in our imaginations that we hold Uber as how everyone behaves, but thankfully not every company that has come up in India in the last 8 years behaves like that. And so this diversity in business models is something that we can really hone in on to see, because there are companies that take on more risk, right? And risk in the platform economy is always seen as what the worker has to do and the costs of the worker. So actually within industry, venture capitalists, private equity will look at different platform business models and say, how much risk does a company take on? And that kind of reclassifies the company as a managed or unmanaged marketplace. And I think this classification is something we don't often use in groups like ours, where we think about workers, we think about location-based work or cloud-based work. But to think about companies for the differential risk they take on is helpful to think about how we can either support them or regulate them. Because the structuring of risk and responsibility that a platform takes on makes a big difference to how its internal policies play out and how its own governance institutions within the platform take on. And I think as a collective group, it's time to start thinking about how we can influence internal platform policies. Because I've been speaking to CEOs and heads of companies for many years now, and they are quite open and responsive to very nuanced, specialized information knowledge that they don't have, that in our circles is very obvious information to have. And so there's a lot of scope there to think about that. And so actually within this industry classification, Uber is seen as a lightly managed model, but there are educational technology companies which employ teachers. They work on the basis of algorithmic management. They might work remotely. They work through ratings and reputation systems, but they fully employ teachers. They have wages, they have employment contracts, and all the other bearings of formal work. And I think these examples are interesting to keep in mind. And a lot of the businesses that I have been looking at in India are small technology businesses, right? They are SMEs. They have a mandate that interestingly does not move towards monopolization. But because they work in sectors where there's not a labor oversupply, or they work in sectors where platforms so far haven't reached, or they have very nuanced services, they do not need they don't need to be monopolies to be sustainable businesses. And there's a large scope there to think about how to create worker well-being for these kind of companies. And in these companies, they move towards creating social and commercial impact, Often a lot of these businesses do not take money from venture capitalists or private equity because they're small enough that they don't qualify for that funding. So they go back to national industrial banks or just bank loans. And so the forces behind them that kind of lead and shape their business models are also quite different from the companies that we might assume and know well. And in these companies, there is scope for bidirectional communication, which is so important to social dialogue. There are human managers that exist. There is constant weekly communication with workers. There are scheduled ways to understand how people are doing, their reviews. And these, give workers a sense of not being left in the lurch. They aren't just behind an app, they're able to know who their employer is, whether they are fully employed or contractually employed. And companies themselves are quite clear that they are moving towards business models that have social proofing as their kind of central value and not just monetary incentives, right? Because small companies who want to retain their workers have to think about how to build reputation systems within their own companies and build mobility within the company as a way to hold on to workers. Because workers' desires for recognition and mobility haven't changed, even though industry has changed. And I think in that sense, just to think about what we can do with some of these findings and insights is because many of these technology companies that are digital platforms, that are digital labor platforms, do use social impact investments. There are ways to kind of work within that community, change the kind of metrics they use in terms of who they fund and how they will continue to fund companies. If we can find ways to insert more metrics around social dialogue into those investments, I think we'll be doing a good job at incrementally helping workers get better. Now, of course, they are SMEs, they are small companies. So the question comes up of, can they survive amongst sectors that do have monopolies, or can they just survive as businesses? And there's an opportunity there to think about what kind of inputs they need, whether they be monetary or taxation based or other kinds of policy regulations that can kind of help them just to create a stable working environment for those platform workers.
I like your sorry,
It's too much. Yeah.
well, so I was saying that, that I like your idea because I think that many times we talk about the big firms, the monopolies, and I think that we need to push for having these voices. Think about an ecosystem, and not only because, and also think that for getting better jobs, we need to help them as well, not only the employee, but these SMEs that are trying to find a new business model. Now, regarding the workers' voice, I think that we still don't have an idea about that. I mean, we have some, people that are talking loud, representing some part of the workers, but we don't have nothing like a union, at least in the global south, that can be representative of this sector. I mean, I think that we still don't have data about them. I mean, because these very people, we don't have data about anything, not only about their participation in labor markets. So I think that it's really, I mean, we need to first try to get the right voices from the workers side, So they are, if you think about place-based platforms, I mean, again, you need to define them better, I think. So they are, I just put some attributes we can say of them. I think that migration, for example, in Latin America is really important because we have open borders, but really tight regulations in labor market. So we have doctors from Venezuela working in Uber, a lot. I must say that 50% of platform workers in Latin America are from Venezuela, and they are over-educated, but not just a minor thing. They're just working in this sector when they are high skilled. So I think that we need to think about them not only in terms of labor market policy, but in terms of social policy, migration policy, and many other things. Then I think that in many cases, as Sting mentioned, I mean, they don't have a choice. They don't choose to work in a platform economy. That's the only way to earn some money. So there's no alternative for them. And that's important to think about asymmetries in power in that case. And finally, regarding them, I think that for many of them, there's a trade-off between income and working conditions. Or in many cases, they don't want the government to get involved in the discussion because they just need space to do more tasks, to sell more tasks, and not just government there, trying to help them. Now, then you have the other part of, we can say, that is cloud-based. And there, we also have a problem of that is hard to find a voice, but just because they don't want to be part of the conversation. They prefer to be out. They prefer to be, operating in a digital space without any attention to regulation or taxes. And of course, we can understand that. But in a way, they can have a voice, but they just decide to exit, in the dialogues. So I think that we need to work harder on understand their motivations, because we don't have data. We know that they work in software, ICTs, translation, writing, all these, online services that are high or medium skill, but then we don't know about them. And so I think that if we need to, again, in global South countries, trying to engage these people in the conversation is really, really important because they are the high skill, they are the high wage economy in our economies. But again, I think that first we need to understand them better. And finally, one comment about the government. In this dialogue, I think that we assume that government capabilities are the same across countries, and that's not the case. First, regarding capabilities, digital literacy among global South governments is really low, really, really low. And second, that in many countries, also in Africa, you can see that many people say, I don't trust the government, so why I'm going to deal with them in a dialogue if I don't trust them at all. So I think that we need to think about this as well when we talk about how to engage in dialogues in the global South, right?
We can pause there.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Really very interesting. I like the nuance that Ramiro put on, which workers do we want to help? Are we necessarily talking about all informal? There's actually some categories of formal workers who need more help. There's some categories of informal workers. Also, I think in a way you provided another answer to the question by Fernando from the ILO on the ILO, for regulation of what he was calling normative instrument on decent work for the platform economy. And your point that it has to be nuanced. It's not the same in different countries. We need to take the context into account. So it's very good to have a global instrument, but then you have to work with the nuances. And also what you were saying, Aditi, on differentiation among different types of employers, and nice to see that there is a trend, or you're seeing a trend towards firms engaging in trying to build models that are provide more better working conditions in general. And also the point on the different regulations that you need, that is not just labor market regulations, that's migration policies as well, I suppose recognition of prior learning and recognition of foreign qualifications as well, if we go into the skills field, which I guess must play a role for, as it does in developed countries, for all the migrants who are heavily overqualified for the jobs that they are conducting. And finally, the point on trusting government, which is very important, right? We need to have that trust in government for social dialogue to be built in any way, to show workers that engaging or trying to engage in social dialogue and employers, there is value to that. And in many countries, there isn't sufficient trust in government to do that. The first discussant, unfortunately, was supposed to be here in person, but couldn't make it. And so it's Andrea Marinucci from the Global DL team. So Andrea, the floor is yours, wherever you are. We'll see your face now.
Hello, good morning. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Good morning. Thank you. Yes, and my apologies for not being there with you in person. And congratulations to the JustJobs Network for the very interesting, innovative, and also thought-provoking research. I'm particularly interested about the suggestion by Mariti and Ramiro to mobilize and encourage responsible business conduct in the platform economy as a means to improve decent work in the sector, and perhaps we can get to that later. I think that in general, Sabina's presentation, but also your presentations this morning, have already highlighted the challenges that platforms and the gig economy more in general create for social dialogue. You talked about the barriers workers face to organize, about power imbalances. So I won't go through that again. We talked about global standards, and I wanted to briefly refer to international labor standards and what they say when it comes to access by workers in diverse forms of work to collective bargaining. I will also highlight quickly what the Global Deal is doing on this topic, as we are currently developing a good practice case study on the impact of the so-called Riders Law approved by the Spanish Parliament in 2021. So as you all know, the ILO principles and rights enshrined in the ILO fundamental conventions are universal. So Convention 87, for example, on freedom of association, and Convention 98 on the right to organize and collective bargaining cover all employers and workers without establishing any distinction when it comes to contractual status. So this means that all workers, including platform workers, should enjoy the rights to organize and engage in collective bargaining. But we know that this is not always the case, including because platform workers face major practical but also legal challenges when it comes to organizing, as you have described very well before. And so I think that this means governments need to step up to ensure that there is an effective recognition of the right to collective bargaining for all workers. And I think that your publication stresses this point and talks about the need for effective regulation, including regulations to ensure that collective representation of workers and also employers should be promoted through public policies. So as already mentioned by many, we've seen examples where governments, we talked about misclassification of platform workers and also how that provides workers with access to labor and social protection rights, but also how that can pave the way for collective bargaining as a means to advance decent work in this sector. And so I wanted to refer to what Global Deal partners are doing on this topic. Many partners have been looking at how to govern labor platforms, and several have also made commitments to advance, to mobilize, to use social dialogue to improve pay and working conditions for platform workers. So as mentioned by Glenda in the opening, a recent decision by the Spanish Supreme Court to classify delivery workers as employees triggered a process of tripartite social dialogue in Spain. And in particular, Spanish trade unions and employers' organizations established a dialogue and contributed to shaping the so-called Riders Law, which came into force in 2021. The law is important because it provides a legal presumption of a dependent employment relationship for platform workers in the delivery sector. And so this means that delivery workers face less barriers to organizing. In addition to that, also, the law introduced a right to algorithmic transparency. And this means that workers' representatives should be engaged by companies on the functioning of algorithms that in particular deal or the parts of the algorithm that deals with working conditions and also access to employment. So we'll be looking at the impact of this law and also at how the law has been opening up space for collective bargaining in the sector. And in fact, in December 2021, the delivery company Just Eat and the main Spanish trade unions signed an agreement which I think could serve as a precedent for future negotiations at the company, but also at the sectoral level. And this is because the agreement covers issues such as pay and working conditions, working time, access to education, and also, although in a limited way, career development, but also access to information about the functioning of the algorithm. The Spanish law and also the agreement are still recent in a way, so it's not so easy to evaluate the effects on working conditions in practice. However, I think that the Spanish model can represent a way forward on how to govern this world of platforms. And as experienced in Spain, classifying platform workers as employees is key to open up space for social dialogue and to have workers and employers find a joint solution that can benefit both parties. And I think also it has been said already that it's important to ensure that there are resources set aside for implementation of these regulations, in particular when it comes to providing support to labor inspectorates, the judiciary system, and this is a problem in the global north, but also maybe in particular in the global south. So just to sum up, as I said, the Global Deal is working on this good practice case study, and I think we're going to be publishing that in the next few weeks. And the objective there is to showcase a positive example of social dialogue in the sector to possibly inspire partners, but also others to take action and improve decent work in the platform economy. And the case study, but also other publications of the Global Deal have also been looking more in general at the informal economy and the contribution of social dialogue. So I think we will keep working on what workers and employers organizations can do to strengthen their legitimacy and also to reach out to those engaged in the platform economy, regardless of their contractual status. So I think briefly going back to the presentation by Aditi and Ramiro, you talked about the need to encourage responsible business conduct in the platform economy. And also you mentioned the need to develop metrics on social dialogue that, for example, investors could consider when supporting platform companies. I wonder if you've already been thinking about what these metrics or disclosures could look like in terms of, to measure the quality and quantity of social dialogue, and how also this approach could be promoted at international level. And I'm interested because as Global Deal, we've been working quite a lot how to promote social dialogue through responsible business conduct, but also about mobilizing social dialogue within the ongoing discussions related to human rights due diligence, legislations, but also practices. And so how we collectively and workers as well can use these processes and these tools in order to improve working conditions and pay. So I'm interested to hear more about that. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. So two Andreas at the price of one. No, I was very interesting to listen to your presentation, and I think indeed it's valuable these moments of exchange, because indeed there are a lot of things to learn also for OECD countries, or at least to think and reflect on the experience from other countries. Because I think there are three messages that I liked a lot, and I think we should incorporate more in our way of thinking. The first is that Aditi said we should work more on finding innovative ways rather than just trying to replicate and extend what we have done so far with, let's say, what we call the standards form of employment. The second message that I liked is that one of these innovative ways is to maybe go around the standard ways that the unions in particular, I'm thinking they try to approach and to directly address management practices of these companies as well as other companies, more going beyond the platform economy, and that I think is not something that is usually at the top of the list of what labor movement in general is aiming at, and also the public discussion focuses on. And the third need to go beyond the dichotomy formal informal and take account of the heterogeneity. So you mentioned the low skilled, the high skilled, that are maybe informal for different reasons, and so we should also then address the reason and in order to if we want to correct it, and also understand why we want to correct it, if it is a tax enforcement issue or is it more on terms of social security and rights and so on, as well as the issue of working poor that is also very much present in OECD countries as well. And for this reason, let's say, for the need to be innovative, the need to find different ways that also speak to the interest and the core concerns of companies, and going beyond the standard dichotomies. That's why I think there is a space and a role for social dialogue and maybe collective bargaining to address this. It has already been said, Stein said it before, on how it can better reflect these nuances and specificities and in each sector and each country. So it's not here that we're going to provide the answer for everyone, north, south, but also in the sectors, even in a given sector, in a given country. And therefore, the social dialogue can come up with more tailored solutions than the law. You mentioned trust in government, of course, an issue that we face, and then, so it's a question for you as well, that we see in OECD countries, that there's also an issue of trust in what we call social partners, let's say labor unions and employers organizations. So some of the platforms do not want to be part of the employers organization. So the platform economy is challenging also the existing traditional employers organization. Some workers do not want to be part of the traditional existing unions because they are seen as the old guards defending the standard workers and so on. So trust in government by all means, but also the issue of trust in those that could represent, and then you need some structure, let's say, to have social dialogue and collective bargaining. It's not all Uber drivers with all possible employers. I think also another area where the OECD countries can learn from the global south and other countries is that certainly there has been a delay from social partners and labor unions in recognizing the issue, because they have been historically focused on the standard forms of employment, and maybe a little bit of delay and a little bit of denial, in the sense that they tried, as you were saying, to push them all back to the standard format, and so that the problem was not the let's say the issue in itself, but was just a coding problem. No, it's not only a coding. You said it can be much more than that. And so I think also on that, I like to know if, despite all the complexities, there are examples of organizing these workers that OECD countries can learn from. The law, so I said all why collective bargaining, social dialogue can be useful, and the law still is needed, I think, to ensure the right framework. And on this, I'm slightly more positive than Stein has been. So compared to 2019, I think what we brought on collective bargaining, social dialogue, I think we have made some steps forward vis-a-vis the law. So a specific issue that we face in OECD countries, and I'm not sure it's really relevant elsewhere, is the potential conflict between labor law and competition law. So the issue is that for competition law, undertakings, companies cannot sit together and fix together something like the price. So if workers are self-employed, coming together and negotiate collectively the price of their service is seen as big supermarket chains coming together and fixing the prices of the food. And this is against the antitrust regulations in OECD countries. So this has led in the past to some rulings that were possibly very in line with the text of the law, but were not necessarily maybe reflecting the reality of what these people were. So this is changing. And so the European Commission, for instance, issued some guidelines the last fall that have opened now the possibilities to negotiate, so that clear the way, the legal way to do it. Still, and that's my last point, still at the end of the day, the main challenge is, okay, we have these guidelines, we have the legal possibilities, the challenge is to organize these workers. So back a bit to one of your last points. So how do we organize these workers? Because without a form of collective organization, it's difficult to do social dialogue. So social is something where you need more than one, and collective bargaining that is by construction collective. So I think that remains in OECD countries the weak link and the weak spot. So I'm wondering if also on this we have there are areas where we can learn from the global south, from your work and studies. But definitely thanks a lot for the exchange and to the global deal, because I think that's also the value added of having the global the OECD, so that we don't only look at our perspectives with our usual lenses, because I think indeed, as Aditi said, we need, at least in some cases, new lenses as well.
Thank you very much, Andrea and Andrea. Aditi, Ramiro, do you want to react?
So thank you to both the Andreas for receiving our presentations very well. Yeah, I think it's always a bit of a challenge to talk about business when you have workers at heart. It's always not the easiest conversation, but I'm glad it's, these are new things we can think about. So Andrea, you had a very, clear question on if I've thought about metrics that we can use around thinking about social dialogue and how that can be quantified. I think there's a little bit of more work to be done in thinking about how the platform model and the marketplace model really breaks down into the ideas of social dialogue. But for companies as they operate, I think it's quite clear that there has to be enough human managers to workers. There's ratios like that are quite low-hanging fruit that we can think about. Companies need to have local headquarters. They need to have operations in local languages. I mean, these are very basic things that we can start to think about, which can be implemented quite easily for a lot of companies. And there are very kind of particular metrics that can be built around the platform model, and economists have a very clear idea of what those how those network externalities work. But I think there's a little bit more research to be done in thinking through that. And Ramiro, you want to respond also?
Yes. Regarding the ILO comment. No, I think that we are not there yet. What I'm saying is that we need to have a fair representation of the different segments of the labor market worldwide, in order to make progress on that. And for that, we need data. We don't have data. So it's kind of, we are just having a conversation. Of course, we need institutions to raise the voice on that. So I'm okay. I like ILO's position on that. But I think that we need to work harder, researchers, communities, and so on, to get real on the data. So it's always, well, to get, to get the right conversations, and not just to start having some debates. Well, I think that thanks the Andreas, we can say, for the comments. Regarding the first Andrea, I think that I really like to hear more then about your country's study on Spain, because that data transparency is really important. We are all trying to figure out what to do on that. And of course, again, we need to think about the new data sharing mechanisms eventually. So in order to do that, we need to get more data. As any establishment that needs to, share some data and another business model. Basic data on tasks, job occupations, and so on. So I think that just trying to get country cases is a good way to think in our countries as well. so regarding your comments, well, I think that, I mean, you can see these high-skilled platform workers that are on the tech industry, and they say, I remember once one told me, like we are free from government regulation, saying we can live in this limbo of no regulations, no taxes. And I think that in a way it's good for them because of the money, but also because there is a deep issue of mistrust. Of course with unions, but also with the government in general. So there you can see these people, these groups saying, I mean, in the past I used to pay taxes, and look, we have this country. We got Argentina. So we don't want that. We want something different. So I'm not going to be part, I'm going to have a voice. I don't want to have a voice in society. So I think it's very difficult to engage them. I mean, and also in a way in our countries, sometimes they are like the devil, because they are the rich people who don't want to pay taxes. So in a way, it's really hard to make them be part of a conversation. They don't trust the government. They don't trust unions. So it's really hard to find some way to some points of like entry points to start the conversation. I think that we are still struggling regarding that. Now, regarding the low skill, I think that you can, for example, in Uruguay, you have an experience of trying to get data first and then to find representations according to these labor markets, instead of just picking one Uber driver who is just screaming, and you will be the leader. Well, maybe, so I think that you can get some cases of first getting data, then find a voice that are very interesting. But also I think that we are seeing this emerging voice saying, I don't trust governments as well. It's like that, like new libertarian voice among young people in low skill sectors that are saying, just give me space, to work. And I don't want the government to get involved. So again, I think that I don't want to be pessimistic, but I think that first we need to get these voices better, who they are, and I can tell you some examples on that.
Yeah, I just to add a last point, I think, to Andrea, what you were saying about, we do need to think about innovative pathways around how to strengthen social dialogue. And just to kind of reiterate why that would be also, because I think there's something about this moment of the technology sector where we also see the state is precarious to that kind of technological capital. It isn't just workers. The tripartite relationship of that social dialogue is based on, the state is not as firm and secure as it used to be. So in that sense, we're dealing with a lot of weakening institutions on all sides. So to really think about moving that around is quite important. And in India, I think how it has played out is that the platform is seen as a way to organize informality, right? It's not a formalization, it's an organization of informality, whether it's a mass of workers, whether it's a mass of worker data. And the platform has become a very important governance actor because of that very reason. And I wonder if those kinds of lessons or examples also will play through in different countries, in OECD countries, because they are becoming very strong actors on all accounts. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I mean, the thing that comes to mind now when Ramiro was saying, well, do these people actually want, to have a voice? I think even apply to the low skill, on the skills front, very often we talk about career guidance, career development. They tell us, I don't want a career. This word doesn't apply to me. I'm not interested. Why? So I think there's, I mean, obviously that applies to skills development, to progression in the labor market, doesn't necessarily apply to other elements of working conditions, like being paid a living wage or number of working hours and other elements of social protection. But there is an issue that some of what we think might be good for some of these workers is not necessarily what they identify with. There is a question from Aliyah Khan, who has raised her hand. So we'll give her the floor to ask the question directly.
Thank you, Glenda. This is Aliyah Khan from Islamabad, Pakistan. And I think what we have done in this session is we are trying to actually reconfigure all the three tripartite partners, because what came to my mind was during this discussion was that the traditional tripartite partner from the government side, which are the ministries of labor and employment, do not really fit the role anymore when we talk of the platform economy. And I wonder if the question of the representative worker organization and the representative employer organization also is going through the same kind of turbulence. So before ILO starts discussion on a new instrument for decent work in the platform economy, I think this issue really needs to get the attention that it deserves. Now, the question of data was raised. At least in Pakistan, there is no registration mechanism for platform economy workers, which is the main source of data regarding minimum wages and social security benefits, etc. And I wonder if there's any innovative thinking about it, because the traditional ministries of labor and employment, it is not within what is called, it's a colonial term, but rules of business. They cannot register these platform economy workers. So where would the repository of data lie? Who would be the government partner who would hold that repository of data in this sense? So thank you very much.
Lots of questions in the room, so let's collect those and then you can bring in.
Thank you. Well, I rather have a comment and not a question. It's to the last remark made by Aditi that platforms in the Global South have organized informal labor and informal sector. And I think this is actually really indeed a very valid point. And that goes back also to my initial remark that when we speak about platform work in the Global South and Global North, those are very different contexts. And indeed, what has been happening is that in the Global North, we had the standard employment relationship. There was a relationship between employer and employee, but also between the state in terms of paying tax, the social security contributions, in terms of having labor law protections and compliance with them, labor inspectorate, enforcement, et cetera, et cetera. So all of these things that existed, while not necessarily all of those things existed in the Global South, and they still don't exist. Either there are laws that are weak or not adapted to the labor markets, or when there are beautiful laws written on paper, they're not enforced. So indeed, there was this big void, and what platforms have done is that they came and they created private forms of regulation, because each platform has its terms of service, and when workers sign up, they agree to abide by the terms of service, which relates also how their working conditions are defined on the platforms, because they agree to abide by the commissions that they have to pay, sometimes the amount of pay that they receive, sometimes what happens in terms of client relationship, how they should dress up sometimes when it's like taxi driving, etc., what kind of services they have to provide. So basically what we see is that the platforms indeed, they created this private forms of regulations that replace or substitute the inexistent public regulations. And this is why for some workers, they actually feel that they are sort of formal, right? Because they have signed up to something. They have some sort of a contract through a platform, something that didn't exist before. And so for some of them, it is a step up as compared to the completely unorganized previously subsistence living. And this is why it's sometimes actually the dialogue with platforms is complicated, because some of them actually have this power of saying, well, we do provide those benefits that did not exist. But the question is bigger for a society. Do we want to have those privately chosen forms of regulation? Or do we want to have a broader consensus and publicly chosen forms of regulation?
Thank you, Maria. Very good point. And Donatai had a point to make. Is that right? No. Yes. Sorry.
That's fine. That's fine. I'll introduce myself. I'm Aisha Zainuddin from Learn Asia. We're part of the consortium here. So I just really wanted to make a comment also that when we are talking, having this conversation, and we're talking about platform workers and, bringing, the informality and all of that. I just want to sort of add that we're not only talking about people who are necessarily on these, freelancer.com or Uber and so on. There is a lot of other digitally mediated work, which is happening, say, through social media platforms, social commerce platforms. And, they are also sort of operating in this informal space, and some of them are micro businesses and SMEs who also employ other people, sort of offline, quote unquote, employ them. But again, that's all kind of happening in the informal sort of segment of the economy. So I just wanted to kind of bring that also into the picture in this discussion. Thanks.
Thank you. Now let's see if I get the name right. Apurva, is that right?
Is this on? Yes. As Glenda mentioned, I'm Apurva from JustJobs Network, and pleasure to be here having this conversation with all of you. So we've briefly touched upon how value in the platform economy is really being generated through two primary means, right? Through actual work that is being performed by workers on these platform economy, and then also through data that is being acquired by these platform companies. And this expropriated data, I would say, which is where a lot of surplus value is generated, because it forms the bedrock for a lot of development that happens of virtual machinery, such as machine learning, your AI, all of these are informed by the data that is collected. Now, our OECD colleagues have mentioned that the idea behind enhancing bargaining power is not just to do it in a certain aspect, right? To do it in a more overall fashion. So not just look at improving working conditions in a particular work, but perhaps figure out how a lot of this data can be accessed. I know Aliyah, I think, talked about how this data can be leveraged for policy making further. So I was wondering if Aditi and Ramiro, Aditi, especially you, since I know you've done some work with unions in India, such as the Federation for App-Based Transport Workers. I was wondering if there is a conversation there happening about this. So we're not just looking at the basic aspect of how do you access better wages, how do you access some sort of social protection, but is there a piece of the pie from the profits that these companies are making through the data that is being collected that workers are demanding or unions are demanding?
So now, no, thank you for that question. I think it's like, Ramiro said that governments need to be kind of upskilled on algorithmic thinking. I think within unions also that conversation is starting to begin. So I think there's a better understanding within the worker community about what software is, but not as much as around algorithmic management and the infrastructure and the decision making behind how algorithms are built. So as early as I think 2017, there were certain smaller unions in India that were asking for all the technology companies that employ them to go through software standardization that already exists within the government of India. And there's a particular kind of registration and certification you get from the Ministry of Electronics and Information Technology. And I thought that was really advanced and quite forthcoming in understanding that there was something around those software systems that weren't working out. But the more nuanced understanding, like as we might have as a group around algorithmic thinking or decision making, is really quite nascent. And the idea behind how much rent is being kind of drawn from the data that these workers give off is not as advanced. And I think just those calculations or that imagination is quite missing. And I think even from the research community, that's also quite a large gap, because again, that's within the intellectual property, as they say, of the platform right now. So there's, I think, quite a bit of work to be done there. Ramiro, you want to add?
Yes, just let me add. Yes, I'm thinking to say just nonsense the first 30 seconds and then that's my solutions, Well, anyway, so I've been involved with the Argentine Parliament, with all these telework discussions and new laws and so on. And I was really surprised about the low level of knowledge about the digital, in general. So it's kind of, I remember also unions saying, okay, we want this, that, and that. Okay, but you need to code that into an algorithm. So maybe we cannot, if you can talk about this, but inside the program, what? No, I mean, for them, it was like, all times, just having a law with all them. So I think that we need to work a lot with unions and with governments regarding algorithmic thinking, but a lot. I mean, they're just thinking about, ICTs, ICTs, I don't know, Facebook, whatever. I mean, maybe you can find some people, but I think that we need to address this issue, And then regarding Marisha's comment on, oh, she's not here. Well, no, because she said that in a way we have this private governance, coming from platform. I think that we used to have, that, but in a decentralized way, with the asymmetries of power, in the offline gig economy. Yeah. So now what we have is a centralized governance, but it's private. Well, not, we need to think about how to make it public. But for me, having platforms is a way to a centralized, governance, public governance. So it's not bad, it's good for me, because there we can engage in conversations, we can get data. So it's like a transition, right? For me, it's not bad.
You can use it to benefit.
Yeah.
Thank you. I'm Gregory Randolph, also with JustJobs Network. I just wanted to raise one other dimension in this conversation about finding worker voice. This could be for Aditi and Ramiro, or for any of those who've studied closely this issue of how to bring social dialogue into the platform economy. And that's that, in traditional forms of collective bargaining between employers and unions, all workers are to some extent considered to have an equal voice in those processes, given that they're all full-time employees. But of course, as we know, in the way that work is organized on platforms, the vast majority of workers are not able to access full-time employment through platforms. And most workers, especially in a global South context, are underemployed on the platform. They might be able to access only, a small amount of their income through that platform. And it's extremely diverse in terms of, you could have some workers who are earning their full income through the platform, others who are just earning a very small amount. And this is also important, of course, when we think through the gender lens, because we know that women are oftentimes not able to engage in platforms as intensively as men are. And so in thinking about locating worker voice and how worker organizations in this context would be run, how do we sort of think about the distribution of voice within those organizations? Who gets to run them? And how do we avoid a situation where those who have the most voice within those organizations are in fact those who are the most successful on the platform, or those who have the most time to engage intensively on it?
Well, I don't have an answer to that, but I think that, again, I mean, it's the same in any sector. I mean, we need to delegate, workers need to delegate to someone that is working as a, not in everyday tasks, right? But as being a leader. So, but again, I think that we don't have the data to have this conversation. So it's kind of, we can think about, theoretically about designing, but we need data in order to understand who can represent them better. I think that we are not there yet, but then we can think of, by sector or by type of platform, you can think about delegates, there. But I think that without data, it's really hard to come up with the optimal way of delegating the decision to a leader,
Thank you so much. Just perhaps one last comment from myself, that it's interesting you made a comment on, in a way, training union representatives. And we are, and Stain's the editor of this, working on a employment outlook dedicated to AI, and writing the skills chapter, the training chapter. And we have repeatedly, we've had requests to include, and it's included now, of course, more clearly, the need to train also the social partners to the potential of AI, because, and the example you give is the perfect example. They have no idea. They're thinking that writing laws like they did many years ago. So very interesting example. I think it's time to move on to the next session, where we'll focus on women. Specifically, so I give the floor to Donathai Sutasana Marli, who is Senior Consultant at the Kinan Foundation Asia, and Mia Tan, who is Technical Director of SEMFRI. I don't know who's speaking first. Sorry, there was a change. Oh.
But of course. So yeah, I will be talking about the findings from research that we did in Cambodia and Thailand, and in which Donathai was very much involved as the project research manager in Thailand. My name is Huy Tam Jam. I'm with JustJobs Network, and I was working as the research manager on this project for the comparative case study that we did there. So really focusing on women's experience of the platform economy, and in many ways, the points that I want to make today very much echo what we've heard already, especially Maria's point about flexibility and the challenges and opportunities associated with this notion. The idea also of a false promise of women's autonomy was raised before. And there was the point made today about the perpetuation of gender norms as well. So I'll very much be talking about that, but maybe from a perspective that's more, that's very much centered on the experience of women that we've investigated in Thailand and Cambodia, and really like showing the research, kind of opening the research notebooks. Sorry, so in the brief blurb that was introducing this panel was the question of how are women faring in this new labor market? So what have we found in Cambodia and Thailand? And also how have we approached this question from a research perspective? So we started from just like sub-background. We were looking in contexts where there is an obvious gender gap in employment. The female participation in the labor force is quite low, like much lower than the male participation in Thailand, slightly lower, like 6 percentage point lower in Cambodia. Here, we cannot really, like, the measurements are made quite differently in the countries where we were looking, but it's a fact. This gender gap in employment is a fact. And we're speaking directly to this narrative in many development circles where that we find, like out there, according to which the platform economy is providing a pool of opportunities to reduce this gender gap and to promote women's empowerment, in particular through opportunities for self-entrepreneurship and so on. From the framework, like theoretically, how we frame this research, we went to, like the relationship between work and empowerment that has been established for a very long time in the literature very much assumes a traditional form of employment where work happens at work. Here we are talking about the type of work that happens for the most part at home. So this was like the topic of our research, home-based platformized work opportunities, and how does this relate to women's empowerment? And we raised the hypothesis that the fact that it happens from home, might actually break the linearity of the relationship between work and empowerment. It doesn't happen only at home, it also happens, of course, on platforms, which means we're talking about very different type of work activities, like very task-based and so on. So all that is the premise of our research, like how we framed it in questioning how does the relationship play out between work and empowerment when we're talking about work that doesn't happen at work and that's of a different nature. We approach this question of that relationship from a capabilities perspective, so really drawing on Nussbaum's Women and Human Development book, so really based on the philosophical premise that there are certain basic capabilities that are almost equal human rights attached to the opportunities to work, including, in particular, the ability to control one's environment. And we went to look for measurements, a way of measuring these capabilities. So building on like Kabir's measurements of resources, agency, achievements. And the question that we asked first, so I've already said it, but really is to what extent does platform work actually relate to women's empowerment? And in conducting this research, we very soon found a confirmation that platformized workers work from home. 81% of all of our respondents say that they work from home. And therefore, we asked the second question, which was, how does this home factor play out in the relationship between women's work and empowerment? To answer these questions, so the data we collected in Thailand and Cambodia amounted to 120 interviews with workers. Very much like the large majority of our workers were women and were platformized, but we also included some men and some non-platformized workers in the mix in order to get like a sense of a comparison. This research was primarily qualitative, so we really went for the deep insights into the workers' experience, but given the large, relatively large sample size, we pushed a little bit the data collection. We actually surveyed all of our participants on their like actual uncertain metrics that I already mentioned, measuring resources, agency, and so on. And we pushed the data collection to have a sample large enough to do some qualitative research. And I'm actually going to show you some of these results mostly today. I just want to note that the workers that we interviewed were involved in 3 types of platform work in 3 different sectors. One is the food delivery sector, but on the food preparation side, where we find more women than on the delivery side that are more men centric. The online retail side and the freelancing platforms. We also had social media, but we found that the social media platforms usually work in addition, like workers work on both types of platforms, like their primary platform and also on social media. This was mentioned also earlier. One thing that I want to mention based on this small table, I won't go into the detail of it, but one of the things that we asked in our small survey was how many people are involved, how many other people are involved in your online work. And on average, we have 1 in 41 people involved. So one person plus 0.40 other person. Note that this figure is actually much smaller for women than it is for men. So we think we do find here evidence, and we know from the interviews that when women are engaging other people in their online endeavors, they're engaging their sister, their mother, someone within the household who, as the business expands, if it does, get involved in a family business, as opposed to men, where we have an average number of people working involved in the business that is at 4. And we're talking about people who are getting together and really leveraging the platform as an opportunity to start a business. So which is kind of a different approach. In response to the question of to what extent does platform work relate to women's empowerment, we went to run a series of regressions. I'm not going to bore you with like a lot of regression tables, but we did find that the more hours per week that workers do that workers work on online platform, we did find that it's associated with greater personal income. And that's like for sure, across the board, the workers that we talk to, the main primary benefit that they get from doing platform work is an increase in an additional income. But that remains an additional income. Most of the workers that we talk to first of all, have another job, like a more formal type of job, and prioritize that job. So the online income, if anything, brings that additional income. We did also measure a significant relationship with the workers' confidence in their own skills. And from the interviews, we know that this confidence in skills comes from a certain sense of satisfaction and almost, I would say, pride. And I've started something and it actually works. And I did learn all of this by myself. I haven't had any formal training in marketing, but I find myself actually doing online marketing. And also having a certain sense of satisfaction in being self-taught and finding their own resources. Where do they find the resources to learn how to do good photographs of their goods, for example? It's on YouTube, so things like that. And we also found that in terms of the measures of empowerment that exists out there, one is the level of autonomy and decision-making within the household. We did find a little bit of evidence of that. However, we found no significant relationship in the between like the work online and the worker's ability to make other types of decisions, maybe bigger ones within the household. No relationship with the size, any significant increase in the size of the professional network, no significant association with feeling like their career is an upward trajectory, and no significant relationship with feeling like they're making a significant contribution to society. And finally, no significant relationship with having improved their work-life balance. So we do find evidence of all of that in the data. And the main factor that we think it all boils down to is the home factor. We're talking about workers who work from home, and therefore, like when you look at all the things that we found that were not significant, or things that workers who work in the formal sector go find because they go outside of the home, because they have access, because we heard earlier, the opportunity to observe how your peers are faring and to be involved in a work environment where there is a career path and opportunities for growth. So we're talking about workers who are very much, self-driven and therefore do not have access to all of that external stimuli. So the home factor, like the immobility that comes with being homebound, we raised the hypothesis is this is where the mismatch is rooted. So we went to examine this relationship as well. We assigned to each of our respondents a homebound value. Is considered homebound someone who doesn't have the opportunity to go out of the house for work, but people who work from home, and whether it's on online platform or for their formal job, are considered homebound. We did find that the relationship between we did find that the more hours that workers do working on online platform, the more likely they are to be homebound. And this relationship is like very strong and very statistically significant. Here, with this homebound outcome, whether people are homebound or not, actually the female being a woman did not make a significant difference here. What made a big difference was like the level of education. The less educated, the more, like being less educated was associated with like more likely to be homebound. But then the second step in this reasoning is actually, we also find that the more hours per week doing online platform work, the more hours spent doing unpaid care work. So we see here like a very strong and significant relationship between you know, this traditional gender role that we know. So not only are women in our sample, we have mostly women, but they're doing tasks that we have said earlier are gendered, but also there's like working online from home enables this perpetuation of also this traditional gender role where they're doing much more unpaid care work. So what we mentioned before is, since we're talking about our respondents for the most part are now like faced with this situation where they are juggling for most of them a formal job in addition to their household duties and other aspects of unpaid work, in addition to this online work that they actually value. If we were to look only at our qualitative data, this flexibility is very much valued by our respondents because it allows, women will tell us, it allows me to do all of the other things that I'm supposed to do and to even do more of them, to pick up my children as opposed to having someone else pick them up for me. But what we do find is actually women are faced with a triple shift, not just a double shift of juggling their paid job and their household duties, but the triple shift of dealing with two jobs and interwoven with like other duties. So finally, what must happen to enable women to avail these opportunities for extra income? And income is, like, we cannot deny that income is one dimension of empowerment and growing control over one's environment, growing autonomy. But how to enable women to avail these opportunities while minimizing the costs of participating in the platform economy? I would say that now that we have observed that these opportunities are there, like the opportunity for a supplementary income to grow confidence in skills. But the limitation, we would argue, comes from this immobility, from the limited social interactions that come with being homebound, and that all of that is associated with actually a reproduction of traditional gender roles, and something that the respondents have mentioned at length is like, as a cost of platform work, as all boundaries become blurred, the boundaries between home and work, leisure time and working time, and also we interpret them as like the boundary between the productive and reproductive functions. And so given these limitations, some ways that we're thinking that are needed to really, in order to move towards empowerment opportunities, maybe promote, you know, like we raised the question of training several times today. Training, I think there's something there in terms of, are there ways to promote training that goes beyond, that actually are the opportunities to maybe have that interactions, you know, that like outside of the home, formal training, I don't know, even within the education system. So this is out of my realm completely, but I don't know to what extent at school people are learning about the opportunities that exist in the platform economy and the costs and challenges associated with it, and how to actually, like we said earlier, maybe the platform economy seems quite marginal, but it's growing and it's also accessible to basically everyone. So to what extent can the training opportunities be formalized in ways that are outside of the home, knowing that formalized training opportunities would also be a platform in a literal sense of the term, a platform for like possibilities of association and so on, that we also know the importance of that very much. So I think I can stop here and let you pursue.
Thanks. Okay. Fortunately, I was doing logistics. Good. Is the new one loading? Okay, no worries. Okay, so I'm Mia Tom. I'm a director with Sentry. Our work focuses not so much on labor markets, but focuses on inclusion and how people earn income. And a lot of our work focuses then on the digital and the financial barriers to people earning income and sustaining their livelihoods. We're based in South Africa and Rwanda, and most of our work is focused on Africa. Okay, so if we look at the role of platforms and how women work in Africa and how they earn, I really like your point, Maria, about you have to start at the right place because most of Africa is informal. Most people are self-employed. So if you look at the role of platforms, then you're not talking about what's the impact on formal jobs with benefits and protection, fixed working hours. You're really looking at what's the role of platforms without any of those protections. And I think that the point's also been made that we have to think about what informality is and what it isn't. There's a lot of things, not just things like tax, but things like the connections and relationships that people have with each other in an informal economy, especially a non-digital informal economy that has huge value, particularly to women. And I think the impact on platforms on those relationships is not well understood at all. If we started to look, first of all, just how many platforms were there in Africa, and we found about 300 of them. And then we started to see to which extent can we actually understand the role that plays in employment. And Maria, again, very similar to your question, I think we can calculate the number of people that currently earn some form of income from platforms, but that's very different to the question of were there jobs created? What is the additionality? What's the quality of this work? And I think we have very limited data on that critical question, without which we really can't make informed policy decisions. So I think that there's a real gap there in what we know about the relevance of platforms for a lot of workers in all our countries probably, but especially if we're trying to delve into the question of the impact and role on women in work. And if I look at just the context of women, kind of what are the barriers and what are the drivers that we typically see? Most of them have been mentioned, but I think a comment was made that barriers to entry for the platform economy is low. And I think in most of the countries where we work, that's not at all the case. It's actually fairly high. You need a lot of digital skills. You need access to good quality internet. You need a lot of self-confidence to be able to engage with a completely new space for you. And I think these barriers are really high and they in particular affect women. And we can clearly see that there is good data on the quality on the gaps that exist there between the access that men and women have to a lot of the digital resources that you need to participate in the platform economy and ultimately benefit from the platform economy. And I think the issue of security is something that we haven't mentioned too much, but that's something of particular concern to women, not just physical security, but also people getting access to where you live, your movements, and just a general sense of lack of well-being that the digital interaction can create, especially if you don't really trust yourself to navigate digital opportunities. There's a sense of loss. And what we found shocking really, and when we interview women, is how they reflect on themselves. They definitely see themselves as vulnerable, as stupid. They're incapable of dealing with digital infrastructure and they need to ask for help. And I must make a big caveat that all these things are very context specific. Some of the barriers are extreme in some countries to the extent where when you interview women, they'll say, but my partner doesn't really want me to have access to information that I can get through digital networks and infrastructure. And in other countries, women are flourishing entrepreneurs that relish the opportunity to use social media to create bigger networks and connect with people. So, you know, I think the talking about Africa or talking about any of our countries as uniform is of course inappropriate, and we need to take these nuances into account. And I think in terms of the drivers, you know, I think flexibility and control in the sense that you're earning a little bit of your own income, also the anonymity, where you might have a separate financial account now to keep the money that your partner or your family doesn't necessarily know about. You know, I think those things are important. And I think we also need to recognize the point that's been made that there's limited alternatives. So it's not as though we're picking between lots of excellent opportunities. There's very little opportunities to make money. Even in your informal world, you're already juggling. We typically find at least 3 to 4 different sources of income, how people are earning income already. And for men, it's often a little bit more on the formal structured side. Women are juggling lots more, 100% informal opportunities. And the reality is this is a form of earning income. If you're in poverty, that's fantastic, and you have to sacrifice a lot of your life to generate that income. So I think that's important to recognize. And then I think if we talk about what's needed, I think this point around the data and the research, the knowledge gap is a really important one, especially around kind of consistent data that you can generate policy on. I think in the absence of that, we have a tendency to react to anecdotal barriers and opportunities, and it becomes very difficult to properly confront the trade-offs that you have to make in the policy environment, because there is no easy, simple solution here. You have to grapple with the realities, and to understand what the reality is, you need better research and information and data. So I think that's the first thing that I think is really important. And then I think secondly, obviously we're talking about the platform economy, but a lot of the policy solutions are really outside of the platform economy. Yes, it's questions of bigger digital policy, but it's also things like transport policy, trade and industry related issues, like how you think about small businesses. Competition's been mentioned, tax, education, all those different spaces, labor, just the capability and the coordination required to solve these kind of issues between people that are thinking about data sharing and people that are thinking about who is an employee and how do I engage with labor unions. You know, those kind of coordination structures are new, and I think emerging across society, and not unique to platforms, but critical to address in addition to thinking about what's required for platforms. And then of course there are a couple of things that are necessary, platforms specifically. And I think that the question of global standards is interesting, because I think there's a real need to establish effective national norms that are context appropriate. But I do think that some of the larger platforms, there's a lack of control at a national level, and mechanisms to hold the big platforms accountable at a national level. If, for example, you're the government of Eswatini and you have 1.5 million people, you know, I think even a big country like India struggles to negotiate with the big platforms. And the point you make about the power of governments in this relationship is a highly complex one. So I think if once we start thinking about global standards, that's obviously one of the things we need to think about is how to create this accountability at the right level, and how to think really about justice in a space of globalization and technology. And then I think the issue of data sharing is important. And again, it has so many dimensions, because yes, we can think about data sharing to better understand and better protect workers. But of course, there's also issues of surveillance, you know, so I think getting those kind of trade-offs right is also something that's critical for the platform economy. And I think key to also understand and speak to platform incentives. And Aditi, I really liked your point there about, you know, how do you think about working within platform structures and speaking to the nature of platform businesses that are very different. and the importance of recognizing scarcity there that puts pressure on often small businesses in the platform economy, like how are they going to survive? And that's one issue that they try and face. And on the other hand, they're often ecosystem builders that are trying to work on both sides, working with employers that are the ones delivering the services to be sold, but then also trying to bring in consumers at an attractive price. And I think, getting that balance right is a potential opportunity in how we think about platforms. Yeah, so I think a very rich conversation. I've really enjoyed it, and I think we could probably go on for a few days. So thank you so much.
Thanks a lot, Mia. I'm sure. Thanks a lot, Mia. I'm sure again, Valentina will pick up on many of these points. I like, of course, the platform specific points, but also the points that are more general, as you say, and those I think echo actually what we find on the gender side at the OECD. And thank you very much, Huetam, as well. I found that as I was listening to your presentation, this sounds ominously close to the discussion on teleworking, right? It's very close. I mean, we're talking about platforms now, but the idea of working from home and how the home element is compromising certain aspects of, career progression, empowerment, and so on, self-confidence, etc. Is, it's very similar issues that we've been discussing for the element of teleworking, which has affected all of us one way or another since the pandemic. So now I give the floor to Valentina, who's our expert on gender at OECD, also expert on gender at the OECD, also in the Employment, Labor and Social Affairs Directorate.
Oh, it's not okay. Thanks a lot, Glenda, and you too for your very interesting presentations. So yeah, indeed, as Glenda says, I'm coming from the more kind of labor market approach to gender equality, looking at the global north. So I'm here to share, very recently we have published this book talking about joining forces for gender equality. We look at main gaps in different sectors, in different dimensions of life that still exist in the most advanced economies. So there is a narrative that is, and unfortunately what we find is that if we look at the book was published 5 years ago, there isn't that major change. Progress is low, challenges are there. So what is interesting to me is to see how to combine these very entrenched, very deep-rooted inequalities, these gaps that are very difficult to close, with a fast changing labor market. So with all these new challenges that are coming in, so how to combine these two things. So from my point, I'm mainly here to share the narrative that we have from the latest evidence on the most advanced economies that still suffer major gaps. And then I would like to reflect a little bit about what elements resonate with what we have mentioned, both in terms of platform economy, but also in terms of the global south. So there's many keywords that I've heard, skills, working from home, and all the issues related to work-life balance, the context, enabling policies. So I think this is a very good basis for further reflection. But let me show some evidence that won't be totally new to you for sure. And maybe just as a starting point to let you know that we have been working at the OECD for a long time on these issues. And we have a couple of recommendations that really look at how to close gaps in education, employment, entrepreneurship, and public life. And we try and generate data on all these elements, mainly looking at OECD economies, but we also try and look especially from the point of view of social institutions and gender norms at the whole world, to the well-known SIGI, that is an indicator that is just out. So I think an important point, and these elements were there already 5 years ago, is, okay, we asked OECD countries, what do you think are the key issues, the most pressing issues when it comes to gender equality? The first is violence against women. That is, of course, a pandemic, and it affects every single element. But then if we look at the other elements, the gender pay gap, the representation in politics and businesses in leadership positions, gender stereotypes, the unequal distribution of paid and unpaid work, all of these elements are very relevant also for people working in the platform economy. if we look at the gaps in employment, we can't avoid looking at what happens when it comes to educational choices, and we see major segregation. Just 1 out of 4 new entrants in ICT is a girl. 1 out of 5 new entrants in ICT studies is a girl. 1 out of 4 in engineering. So girls still remain very underrepresented in the STEM fields, and so are, of course, their career expectations. And there's, in the other way, an overrepresentation of girls studying more humanistic studies, education and health related. All of these, even if in the most advanced economies, access to education now is equal for girls and boys, these differences then translate in major differences also when it comes to the labor market. So if still now at the OECD, on average, women are 10 percentage points less likely than men to be in employment. And when they are, still they dedicate fewer hours to paid work. We see that very clearly. So it's around 5 fewer hours per week in paid work, less compared to men. Why? Of course, because they shoulder most of the unpaid work. That is something that becomes very relevant when we think about working from home, combining these two sides of the coin. And they still remain underrepresented when it comes to leadership positions. So just around 1/3 of management roles in companies, but also in public employment in OECD countries are on average held by women. All of these differences, of course, result in something, an indicator that is key, that is the gender wage gap. So on average, at median earnings, women still make around 12% less than men, with major differences, of course, across countries. And these differences also derive from the fact that there are differences for what we call within firms. So when women and men, when we look at women, similarly skilled women and men working in the same firms, they tend to have different tasks. And for 1/3, it's related to women and men concentrating in different sectors. So the segregation and women being overrepresented in typically lower paying sectors, and men being overrepresented in better paying sectors such as ICT. So we have here some data showing us, and we see that in every single country for which we have data, women are underrepresented in ICT task incentive jobs when we compare to men. And similar narratives exist also when we look at entrepreneurship in terms of motivation. So the motivations that push women and men to engage in entrepreneurship are different. Typically, women are more likely to engage in entrepreneurship because they do not find valuable opportunities in paid work in the formal labor market. When they do, they are less likely not only to start a business, but also to be self-employed and also to employ others. And there's also there a segregation in different sectors. There is, even though these gaps persist, there has been some policy progress. I would say an important side that we also show in our research is that there is an increasing attention to the gender dimension, not only in these more traditional, more studied areas, but also we see areas such as energy, transport, trade, foreign direct investment that are paying more and more attention to what happens to these gender gaps. They're trying to generate data that, of course, until now have been lacking, but there is an effort to produce more data to better understand and better tackle these inequalities. And then, of course, and you were mentioning that as well, there's a context aspect that is very important. We need a number of policies that allow women to be actually fully engaged in the labor market. We've seen some progress when it comes, for example, to paid parental leave and in also changing the norms by ensuring that fathers become more involved in taking this leave and therefore more involved in caretaking roles. We have seen major improvements and changes in teleworking regulations, of course, inevitably since COVID. Lately, there's more and more attention. It's really a momentum now, especially in the European Union, on pay transparency measures to really try and, through audits and other instruments to give data on different pay between men and women. And also there's been, even though not major, but there has been over the past years some progress in terms of representation of women in the public and private leadership positions through the use of quotas, targets, but also other measures. And all of this comes from an increasing attention to gender mainstreaming. So we see more and more countries having their own gender equality strategy or including gender objectives in national strategies, but also adopting tools such as gender impact assessment, gender budgeting, to make all of the policy actions in different areas more gender sensitive. I was thinking a little bit, not being myself an expert in platform work, about, okay, what are the potentials, what are the risks and the barriers or enabling factors when it comes to gender equality and platform work. I think you have mentioned many of these already, you know, reducing entry barriers, easing the job search process. What we see in this latest evidence that we have produced is indeed that we have examples from many countries, for example, of women who engaged in jobs more internationally. So they broadened their perspective, their geographical bound. So they broke their geographical boundaries so they could access more work, but also more women being involved in international trade, e-commerce, thanks to the use of platforms. But all of these risks, as you were mentioning, are to me already very relevant in the traditional labor markets, so to say, and are probably risk to be exacerbating on the platform work. So I'm thinking discrimination, stereotypes, gender norms. Glenda, you were saying before about telework. Okay, telework gives a lot of flexibility, but also we talk a lot about the flexibility stigma. So on one side, what does it mean to be working from home for a man or for a woman, but also all the additional work that we've seen, especially during the pandemic, being shouldered mainly by women. Then I'm thinking about this segregation. So I don't know if this also happens in platform economy, but we see that, for example, women engaging in entrepreneurship that in the end up being entrepreneurs in the education or in the personal care economy. Does this also happen in platform work? And then, of course, all the issues related to job quality. Of course, these apply to all platform workers, I would say, but also when we look at the informal economy, there's evidence that says that within the informal works, women are often worse off. So I think all of these aspects are also of relevance, which brings me also to the point of the ecosystem enabling factors. So the need to, of course, you were mentioning opportunities for upskilling, training, and also I'm wondering what happens with these self-acquired skills you were mentioning before. Are they easily then transferable to other sectors, other jobs, issues like access to connectivity, technology, but also the need for family-friendly policies that actually allow women to engage in labor, childcare, but also the fact that there is, first of all, that they have access to leave around the birth of their children, but also that this is shared. And this also affects the norms attached to the expectations of the role of men and women in society and in the world of work. So the point of gender data, I think, is also very important. The transparency in the OECD is really now giving so much attention to that aspect, but also putting also a focus on the idea of fair work and equal pay, and then the issue of regulation. So these are just some of my points, and I would like to thank you so much for your very inspiring interventions.
Thank you so much, Valentina. And I think we all also heard a few thoughts from Maria at the very beginning on the gender aspect of the digital work. So we can also take those into account. I've asked the public if they have questions. I fear we are between the lunch or dinner or going to sleep for some, or even breakfast in some cases. But I'll let you react in any case to what Valentina has just said.
Yeah, I'm happy to start.
Just a mic.
I definitely like your point about the ecosystemic approach. I think it echoes what you were saying, Mia, in thinking in terms of many of the regulation that we might want to promote in order to enhance and the opportunities for women in the platform economy might have to happen outside of the platform economy itself, like whether these are, in working in terms of promoting disrupting traditional gender norms or promoting better educational opportunities or I think these are like, this is an extremely important point to take away. Go ahead.
Yeah, no, I agree. And it's wonderful to see all the data you have access to, very jealous. But I think what's sometimes challenging with the data is also understanding the numbers. And I think something I always grapple with when I'm thinking about equality and how women are working is the question of choice and preference. Things like women entering the ICT space, women spending time looking after children. I think you want to make sure that people can live the lives they want to live without necessarily constraining choices. And that's where things like policies around also helping men to be more engaged with child rearing, all those kind of things. I find that very exciting. But of course, in most of the countries where I work, that's not really an option. There's no childcare, there's no leave. And I think that's also challenging when we're thinking about self-employment on platforms is even the idea of leave, because you can take leave, but then you don't earn income. So, and minimum wages and all those kind of things. I think these are areas that the platforms are not necessarily worsening, but they're definitely entrenching. So I think that's definitely something to keep in mind. But thanks so much.
Is it on? Yes. I think I've been introduced twice. I'm Samali. I'm from the Keenan Foundation Asia. We're based in Bangkok. Just wanted to add a couple of things from Hoitam's presentation, because I was the one who collected the data as well. So I just want to note a couple of things. So Hoitam did mention that with a lot of the workers that we've talked to, they use multiple types of platforms, right? And a lot of the times it's social media platforms in combination with other platforms. So for instance, like social media with food delivery, social media with e-commerce, social media with freelance, etc. But actually they tend to use social media platforms as the main platforms. And I think the reason, at least based on the people we've talked to, is of course based on both flexibility and autonomy. So in terms of flexibility, if you compare food delivery platforms with social media platforms, so if you are a person who make food at home and you try to sell online, it's much more flexible to use social media to do that. Whereas if you use like food delivery platforms, there are certain rules, again, like you said, like there are certain rules that come with being the workers on these platforms. You have to, say when you're gonna work, the hours of operation, the types of menu that you're gonna do. It's like, it has to be sort of established business, right? Whereas if you're looking for flexibility and you want to change the menu, you want to change your work hours, social media is much better. But another thing is autonomy. Social media also helps with autonomy, because if you compare, for instance, freelance platforms with social media platforms, freelance platforms, most of them, you just kind of post your profile out there, and then you just wait for someone to contact you and engage with you to give you the work. Whereas on social media, you're more active, right? You can present yourself, you can engage with so many people, you can join these groups, these communities online, and then you seek the work through these social media platforms. So I think there's like very obvious in Thailand, where our like Facebook users are like fifth highest in the world, even though our population is only 70 million. So you see like people like the trend towards this use of social media platforms for work. And a lot of times is, again, gives the impression of formality, I think like Maria has mentioned, but in this case is formality in the sense that there's some sort of, like you have a business page and things like that, like you feel like you now exist in a formal space. And I think platforms and a lot of tech companies also like increasingly realize that. So like there's some development, for instance, like Google, there's like this thing called Google business profile, right? Like, or it used to be called Google My Business, which in the past, it only allows people who has a storefront to use to tell other people that, hey, I'm here. Nowadays, they allowed people who don't need any physical presence, like you can just have an online store and you can work online through things like that. So I think like I think in the beginning we were talking about like focusing on a lot of these like labor platforms, like more labor workers, but increasingly because of the trend of, again, women engaging in entrepreneurships, and they tend to use social media a lot more. So we have to think of a lot of these social media platforms as, part of this platform economy, and not only looking at, again, like the Uber model that we've been talking about a lot. I actually, Valentina, I have a question for you, and it might not be directly related to platform economy, but I was just curious because you mentioned like some of the family-friendly policies, and you mentioned paid parental leave. And I'm just wondering, could you elaborate a little bit more in terms of like what have been the effects of that? Because that's not something that we have in Thailand. Like we only have maternal leave, like the law only mandates that. We don't have parental or something like that. So yeah, thank you.
Sure. So I think actually it's important to make a distinction. One thing is that you have available parental leave and paternity leave. So of course, beyond maternity leave that is available to fathers. This doesn't mean that fathers are going to take it. So what we see as the best and latest development is that countries are increasingly dedicated a specific amount of leave just for the fathers, either on a use it or lose it basis, or if you get both the mother and the father to take a minimum number of leave, then there is an additional month, for example, of leave that can be shared. So it's really this way of creating incentive, not only to giving, because there's countries, Japan, Korea, that have a lot of leave available to fathers, but fathers do not actually take it. So how to use these measures to really change the norms? And this is where the real improvements have happened. It's where this has been made just available exclusively for fathers, reserved for fathers. So yeah, I think it's these two steps, not only having this available, but also making sure that it's not fully shareable. So the example of Iceland is one of the best ones, because since very early on, they reserve a specific period of leave for the mother and for the father. Or the example of Germany, because through this bonus month is also a good one, because there is an incentive for both parents to take some leave in order to get this additional leave. But I mean, the situation is there's a lot of variation also within OECD countries in terms of availability, in terms of use, and also there's the issue of data, because there's just a few countries that actually track the use of this leave. So it's definitely an area where we have seen major improvements, but there's still a lot to do. Yeah.
And I want to thank Donatai as well, because one of the questions I had, but I didn't ask because I didn't want to monopolize the conversation with Prerna and Sabina at the beginning, was you have all this classification of platforms, and what do you see as the key differences in terms of challenges and opportunities, and your intervention about, how different the situation is if we're talking about social media platform compared to platforms like, Uber or Deliveroo or whatever else. So I'm very glad that we had a chance to bring that up as well. I don't think there's a point in me summarizing the discussion because we are already running a little bit late, but I want to thank everybody. It's been extremely rich, very interesting for me, and I'm sure very interesting for the colleagues who are online, but also for colleagues who are here, who are or were here as part of the discussion from the OECD. So many thanks to you for coming to see us. I hope it's been useful for you, and we'll keep talking about these issues with great pleasure. We're also happy to facilitate further discussions with anybody today that you may want to go into more details about their work. So thank you very much for coming.